Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The dust crunched beneath Bill's boots as he ran, heart pounding and sweat running down his face. The gunshot still rang out behind him. His gang was dead. He knew it. They didn't concern him, though. He could find more people to serve as his underlings. What concerned him was getting the hell away from that man. That weren't no man, he thought frantically as he almost tripped on a loose rock. That there was the devil. He knew that by all accounts his actions made him yellow, but living cowards were better than dead fools. If they was gonna try taking on the damn devil, serve 'em right, he reasoned. Making it to one of the unoccupied homes, Bill quickly entered, opening his pack, and began hastily shoveling as much food as he could fit. At least there were fewer mouths to feed now. Once he shoved enough into the saddlebags, he mounted his horse and began riding away. While he rode, he heard the deep cackle of the stranger behind him before he called out.
Run all you like, Billy boy. I'll find you.
He only rode faster. 3 days passed and he kept riding. He didn't stop, not for food, not for water, not for sleep. He cursed the distance of Angel's Pit from civilization, ignoring the fact that he had chosen it as a hideout for that very reason. He didn't think about that now, though. What was important was that he found somewhere to hide. He needed to get somewhere to lie low before the stranger's gray horse appeared over the horizon. Even before his gang had started shooting, he knew something was off. The stranger, face covered in burns, had come from nowhere, trotting into the abandoned town, Angel's Pit, as if he owned the place. As the Oakley gang, a group of 15 bandits aimed their guns at the man on the ashy gray horse, he stepped down and held his hands up. Now, gentlemen, he said in a voice dry and hoarse as a lifelong smoker. I didn't come here for no shootout. Even as his hands were up, he smiled. Who in the hell are you? What's your business here? Demanded Bill, seeming mildly perturbed by the grinning intruder. Chuckling, he replied. Call me what you like. As for what my business is... He paused as if trying to find the right words. Call it collection. Well, you done picked the wrong place for collecting, mister, Bill replied with only the swaggering confidence a bandit leader could. I don't rightly know what you was hoping to collect, but anything worth having is... Calm yourselves now. I didn't come here for no money. And I didn't come here for no food either. Puzzled, Bill approached the stranger, his revolver still aimed at him. Why then? Who sent you? You a lawman? Bounty hunter? Tapping his chin, the stranger hummed thoughtfully. You could say the latter, but you still wouldn't be quite on the mark there, William Abernathy. Everyone noticed when their leader froze. His voice now came out in a slow stutter. How in the hell do you know that name? Not even his gang knew his true family name, instead addressing him as Red Bill Oakley. I know plenty of things about you, Billy boy, the stranger said, his grin widening. looking more grotesque with his burns.
I know that you was one of them slave catchers back when that shit was still legal. Brought a bunch of escaped folks back from the north. Put 'em back to work on your pa's plantation. Some of them were conveniently enough.
His grin lowered into a hateful sneer, and his voice became a disdainful hiss.
Damaged upon arrival. Beaten, bones broken, missing limbs. Wouldn't stop bad-mouthing you and your pa. Couldn't even be sewed off. Couldn't put the irons on 'em, so you had to put lead in 'em, yeah? Even Abigail, especially Abigail. All 'cause your dear little brother Jack loved her.
The rage at which he spoke her name caused Bill's face to drain of all his bravado. He gazed at the stranger with the terror of a man facing the gallows as the memories of Abigail flooded back. The pleas of her mother to kill her instead. The callous slap he gave the woman. The shot. The wails that only a grieving mother could make. The horrified, betrayed screams of Jack. Tears fell from his eyes, but not because he felt remorse for the life he had lived. It was the fact that this stranger knew everything about it. That ghastly smile split the stranger's face again at Bill's fear. I hit the nail on the head, didn't I, Billy boy? The revolver shook in Bill's hand, lowering slowly, and his gang looked upon him with a mix of shock, disgust, and terror at the stranger. As if he could sense their shock, he turned his head towards one of the bandits, a red-headed man.
Oh, don't act like you're so innocent over there, Johnny. Remember how you stole Daddy's gun when you were 15? Shot your little brother for stealing sweets from you?
He turned his head to another man in the group, a 24-year-old man with a full beard.
Or you, Bert, when you left your pa to die in a fire you started over an inheritance you spent on drinking and whoring, then joining these pricks when it ran dry? Same goes for all of you. Birds of a feather and all that. I could go on, but I didn't come here for judging. That's someone else's business. As I said, I came here for collecting.
Bill felt the cold, dead eyes before he saw him. Mistaking the stranger's intentions, he said, You can have Benny over there. Never really liked him. He gestured at one of the younger bandits, who looked at his once trusted leader with shock and betrayal on his face. However, the stranger's teeth just glinted in the moonlight as his grin widened further. He threw his head back and laughed much too hard for anyone under these circumstances. So much so that Bill winced in surprise.
Ain't very bright, are you, Billy boy? This here ain't no matter of sacrifice. I said, I came here to collect.
He emphasized the last word, looking directly at Bill, then the rest of the gang. The leader caught on, as did the others.
Any volunteers?
The stranger asked, half rhetorically. A rifle shot caused Bill to jump as one of the other bandits, Cole, fired upon the stranger, the round hitting him square in the chest. Blood began to spread under the surface of the duster. Then, to the horror of the entire gang, He looked up and grinned at Cole like a fox cornering a hen.
We have a winner.
Without hesitation, his hand shot like a rattlesnake for his holster, then drew his revolver. In the moonlight, the engraving on the weapon shone, revealing itself to be a snarling wolf. He fired, leaving a vermilion smear on the rocks behind him. The rest of the Oakley gang ran for cover, then began firing at the stranger. All they did, however, was create new targets. When 5 more of the gang lay dead on the desert ground, the remainders continued firing wildly, letting their desperation and fear snuff out their better judgment. Casually, even as round after round hit him, the stranger opened the cylinder for his gun, then dropped a bullet in each chamber before turning to the rest of them. After reloading, he began firing at each man who fired first. None noticed that their leader Bill had escaped into the night. They kept shooting, but he didn't flinch no matter how many bullets entered his body. Soon he finished his bloody work. Once that had been done, he had crossed out the names on the piece of paper given to him by the broker. All that was left was William Abernathy. His ears picked up the faint sound of hooves fleeing the hideout, and he smiled. So the vermin wanted a chase, did he? Fine by him. These others had served as little more than entertainment, appetizers in a sense.
Run all you like, Billy boy. I'll find you,
he yelled into the desert. He mounted his horse, then began a patient trot after his prey. Bill kept urging his horse, but the beast's steps were slowing down, and its breathing was labored. The escape had exhausted the poor horse, who stumbled and toppled to the ground. In a mix of frustration and hysteria, he leapt from the saddle, then shot the animal between his eyes. Grabbing whatever supplies he could from the saddlebags, he began looking around wildly for somewhere, anywhere to hide. His legs propelled him by otherworldly terror. He ran ahead, then was overcome with joy and relief. A cave. Unable to believe his luck, he quickly got inside. He began rummaging through the saddlebags. A horrified gasp escaped his lips as he realized his error. There was food, but the bags contained no water, and there was very little money that he could use when he got to the next town, and only a few boxes of ammunition. Not that the last part mattered, as he had only brought the one revolver in his panic. He slumped against the wall of the cave. Bill knew he was done for. It didn't matter if the stranger found him or not. He was dead anyway. As if on cue, he heard the hooves. Suddenly, inexplicably, his fear was overwhelmed by rage. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. He was Red Bill Oakley, one of the greatest outlaws Texas had ever known. When they passed through towns, the bartenders in the saloons would offer them free drinks in exchange for sparing them. Townsfolk would throw money at his feet if he so much as looked at them. They would be given residence in any inn or house, free of charge, just for letting the occupants live. Sometimes they spared them. Sometimes they shot or robbed the occupants anyway. Even burned the residences to the ground just for fun. People respected them because they were afraid of him. Afraid that their town might become the next Angel's Pit. And in one night, this stranger had walked into the home he had rightfully stolen, killed his entire gang, and was now chasing him. For what? He seethed. Abigail would have taken Jack with her, the little harlot. Seeming to forget or not care that his gang's bullets had done no harm to the stranger, he cocked back the hammer on his revolver as the hooves got closer. As soon as it was about to round the edge of the cave's mouth, he ran out, aiming the gun and letting out a vicious shout, which died on his lips. The horse was there all right, but there was no rider. As the bewildered Bill tried to make sense of all this, he heard a short whistle behind him. Slowly, almost as if he were being controlled by some outside force, he turned. In the back of the cave was the stranger, grinning and shoulders shaking lightly from his chuckling, like a child who had been hiding and waiting to jump out and scare someone. Bill recoiled and screamed with enough terror to wake the dead, then hastily aimed his pistol and fired once, twice, 3 times. This was followed by 2 more before a hollow click signaled that the gun was empty. Bill whimpered as he remembered that he had used a round to kill his steed. As the uninjured stranger exited the cave, Bill stumbled and fell, scooting back frantically.
Please,
he stammered, rage forgotten and once again overwhelmed by terror.
Please, let me go.
We both know I can't do that, Billy boy,
the stranger said with a falsely sympathetic expression. Bill tried to scramble away, but the stranger's hand clasped around his throat and slammed him against a large rock. His strength was unnatural, especially for someone so thin.
You still haven't recognized me, have you?
He asked, sounding almost disappointed as he began tying them up.
Should I?
Bill asked. Placing a hand over his heart, the stranger feigned offense. When he spoke next, his voice seemed to become less gravelly, sounding younger as well.
Well, I'm wounded.
I thought for sure you would have recognized your own flesh and blood, Billy boy. There was a moment of silence as he registered the voice. Now that he was speaking that way, though, there was no mistaking it. He had seen those burns when his father's killer was hanged.
Jack?
The stranger's face morphed into the same sneer he held when he mentioned Abigail. He kicked Bill in the ribs, driving the wind out of him.
Goddamn straight, you little shit,
he growled, his voice returning to the previous gravelly voice. Bill squirmed on the ground, groaning in pain and pulling at the bindings.
Why? Why?
Jack repeated in a mocking falsetto, then cruelly kicked him again.
You know goddamn well why.
The memory of Abigail came to Bill's memory.
Then that was why you burned Pa's plantation when you got home from the war?
Bill asked, his tone accusatory, despite his fear and pain.
Why you killed Pa?
I killed Pa for everything he did to those folks. He treated them like animals on the best of days, remember?
Bill shook his head, either in disbelief or in denial. He then reached down and began rummaging through Bill's pockets, seeming to be looking for something. Eventually, he found it. Their mother's engagement ring, which he had planned to give to Abigail before her death. For the first time, an expression besides cruel glee or anger crossed his face. His face fell, and Jack clutched the ring in his fist, as if it would somehow bring back the woman he was about to offer it to. His memories were interrupted by Bill, and he was almost glad for it. He was never able to deal with grief well. Anger was much easier to express, especially so because Bill, the man he once called his brother, was laughing bitterly.
That's all you wanted?
He cried out as he kept laughing, the sheer ludicrousness of the situation almost breaking his mind.
Ma's ring? You killed my gang, ruined my reputation, chased me all the way out here in the desert for that ring?
Oh no, Bill.
Jack replied coldly, beginning to draw some strange symbols on the ground as the laughter continued.
I told you before, I was here to collect. Thing is, I'm here on someone else's behalf.
Bill's laughter gradually faded as he noticed the symbols making a circle around him.
Jack?
He asked uncertainly.
What are...
The symbols glowed scarlet, and suddenly, with a flash of red, they were joined by a third stranger. A tall, clean-shaven man without a bead of sweat on his skin despite the desert heat. The well-dressed stranger looked down from his place on a large white horse. It was the broker. He examined Bill with an appraising look, as if he were a merchant determining the value of a potentially valuable object. He turned to Jack and asked, "So, is this the soul, then?"
Don't see anyone else round, do you?
Jack said sardonically. "Merely a formality," replied the broker coolly. Bill looked back and forth from the man to Jack. Then it all fell into place.
Jack, you can't be...
I am, Bill,
Jack replied venomously.
You sent me to hell when you killed her. The gallows just finished the job. Except you won't be getting the luxury that your friends and me did. We at least had a little moment of darkness and silence when we died, just before the fire came. But you... you ain't getting off so easy. You'll be going to hell alive first.
Tears began to run down Bill's cheek.
No! Jack, please! I'm so sorry!
He blubbered pathetically. Ignoring his brother's tears, crocodilian or not, Jack handed the list to the stranger, who gave him an envelope, then gave a brief whistle as if calling a dog.
"Come on, boys!"
the broker exclaimed.
"Supper time!"
Without warning, the symbols glowed again, and the head of a snarling black canine shot up from the ground where Bill was lying and sunk its teeth into his arm, accompanied by many more. He screamed and struggled and begged and cursed, but Jack just watched as Bill was dragged by the hounds.
So long, Billy boy,
he said mockingly.
Don't forget to say hi to Pa for me, you hear?
The last sight Bill saw of the earth was of his own brother grinning as he entered the inferno. When it was done, the broker whistled, seemingly in amazement.
"I'm beginning to understand what the client sees in you, Jack," he remarked. "You are a ruthless one, aren't you?"
The bounty, please,
Jack said curtly. The broker simply nodded and pulled out an envelope which he handed to Jack. He then tipped his hat, then rode away, vanishing into thin air. Jack opened the envelope. The paper inside showed the names of the bandits, along with numbers next to them, the worth of their souls due to their evil deeds. At the bottom it read, remaining number of souls required for redemption, 72. He sighed, then put away the paper. It wasn't much, but it got him closer to his goal. He held the ring in his hand again. For the first time in years, he gave a small, genuine smile as tears welled up in his eyes, drying them quickly as if he was worried to be caught crying. He tucked the ring into his coat, then mounted his horse and rode off into the desert to await his next contract. He didn't think he trusted the client all too well. Only fools did. But all the same, if there was even a sliver of hope of seeing his beloved Abigail again, he would take it. Until then, he would paint the entire West red if need be.
On a blue afternoon in autumn, Riku and Miki drove south from Numatsu in his silver convertible along the coast of the Izu Peninsula. The temperature was mild for the end of October, and the air was clear, the sun glinting off the Suruga Bay. She wore sunglasses and, to protect her hair, a yellow scarf with a design of orange butterflies. He wore driving gloves, a black dress shirt, and a loosened white tie. The car, the open road, the rush of the wind made it impossible to converse, and so, for miles, she watched the bay to their right, and he the rising slopes of maple and pine to their left. Just outside the town of Dogoshima, a song came on the radio. Just you, just me. And they turned to look at each other. She waited for him to smile. He did. She smiled back. And then he headed inland to search for the hidden onsen in Ugami. They'd met the previous night at the Limit, an upscale hostess bar. Riku's employer had a tab there, and he was free to use it when in Numatsu. He'd been once before, drunk, and spent time with a hostess. Her conversation sounded rote, like a script, her flattery grotesquely opulent, and therefore flat. The instant he saw Miki, though, in her short black dress with a look of uncertainty in her eyes, he knew it would be a different experience. He ordered a bottle of Nika Yoichi and 2 glasses. She introduced herself. He stood and bowed. They were in a private room at a polished table of blonde wood. The chairs were high-backed and upholstered like thrones. To their right was an open-air view of pines and the coast. She waited for him to smile, and eventually he did. She smiled back and told him, "I'm writing a book." Riku said, "Aren't you supposed to tell me how handsome I am?" "Your hair's perfect," she said. He laughed. "I see." "I'm writing a book," she said again. "I decided to make a study of something." "Oh, you're a scientist," he said. "We're all scientists. We watch and listen, take in information, process it. We spin theories by which we live." "Well, what if they're false?" "What if they're not?" she said. He shook his head and took a drink. They sat in silence for a time. She stared out past the pines, sipping her whiskey. He stared at her. "Tell me about your family," said Riku. She told him about her dead father, her ill mother, her younger sister and brother. But when she inquired about his parents, he said, "Okay, tell me about your book." "I decided to study a season, and since autumn is the season I'm in, it would be autumn. It's a natural history of autumn." "You've obviously been to the university," he said. She shook her head. "No, I read a lot to pass the time between clients." "How much have you written?" "Nothing yet. I'm researching now, taking notes." "Do you go out to Thousand Tree Beach and stare at Fuji in the morning?" "Your sarcasm is intoxicating," she said. He filled her glass. "No, I do my research here. I ask each client what autumn means to him." "And they tell you?" She nodded. "Some just want to say how big their biceps are, but most sit back and really think about it. The thought of it makes all the white-haired Oji-san smile, the businessmen cry, the young men a little scared. A lot of it is the same, just images, the colorful leaves, the clear, cold mornings by the bay, a certain pet dog, a childhood friend, a drunken night. But sometimes they tell me whole stories." "What kind of stories?" "A very powerful businessman. One of the other hostesses swore he was a master of the 5 elements. Once told me his own love story about a young woman he had an affair with. It began on the final day of summer, lasted only as long as the following season, and ended in the snow." "What did you learn from that story? What'd you put in your notes?" "I recorded his story as he told it, and afterward wrote, 'The story of a ghost.'" "Why a ghost?" he asked. "I forget," she said. And I lied. I attended Waseda University for 2 years before my father died. "Well, you didn't have to tell me," he said. "I knew when you told me you called the businessman's story the story of a ghost." "Pretentious?" she asked. He shrugged. "Maybe," she said and smiled. "Forget about that," said Riku. "I will top that Make Inu businessman's exquisite melancholy by proposing a field trip." He sat forward in his chair and touched the tabletop with his index finger. "My employer recently rewarded me for a job well done and suggested I use, whenever I like, a private onsen he has an arrangement with down in Itsu. I need only call a few hours in advance." "A field trip?" she said. "What will we be researching?" "Autumn. The red and yellow leaves. The place is out in the woods on a mountainside, hidden and very old-fashioned, so no frills. I propose a dohan, an overnight journey to the onsen Inugami." "A date?" she said. "And our attentions will only be on autumn? Nothing else?" "You can trust me when I say that is entirely up to you." "Your hair inspires confidence," she said. "You can arrange things with the house on the way out." "I intend to be in your book," he said, and prevented himself from smiling. After hours of winding along the rims of steep cliffs and bumping down tight dirt paths through the woods, the silver car pulled to a stop in a clearing in front of a large, slightly sagging farmhouse, Minka style, built of logs with a thatched roof. 20 yards to the left of the place, there was a sizable garden filled with dying sunflowers, with 10-foot stalks, their heads bowed. To the right of the house, there was a slate path that led away into the pines. The golden, late afternoon light slanted down on the clearing, shadows beginning to form at the tree line. "We're losing the day," said Riku. "We'll have to hurry." Miki got out of the car and stretched. She removed her sunglasses and stood still for a moment, taking in the cool air. "I have your bag," said Riku. and shut the trunk. As they headed for the house, two figures appeared on the porch. One was a small old woman with white hair, wearing monpe pants and an indigo karazome jacket with a design of white flames. Next to her stood what Miki at first mistook for a pony. The sight of the animal surprised her and she stopped walking. Riku went on ahead. "Grandmother Chinatsu?" he said, and bowed.
"Your employer has arranged everything with me. Welcome," she said.
A small wrinkled hand with dirty nails appeared from within the sleeve of the jacket. She beckoned to Miki.
"Come, my dear, don't be afraid of my pet Ono. He does not bite."
She smiled and waved her arm. As Miki approached, she bowed to Grandmother Chinatsu, who only offered a nod. The instant the young woman's foot touched the first step of the porch, the dog gave a low growl. The old lady wagged a finger at the creature and snapped, "Humidity!" Then she laughed, low and gruff, the sound at odds with her diminutive size. She extended her hand and helped Miki up onto the porch. "Come in," she said, and led them into the farmhouse. Miki was last in line. She turned to look at the dog. Its coat was more like curly human hair than fur. She winced in disgust. A large, flattened pug face, no snout to speak of, black eyes, sharp ears, and a thick bottom lip, bubbling with drool. "Oh no," she said, and bowed slightly in passing. As she stepped into the shadow beyond the doorway, she felt the dog's nose press momentarily against the back of her dress. In the main room, there was a rock fireplace within which a low flame licked two maple logs. Above hung a large paper lantern, orange with white blossoms, shedding a soft light in the center of the room. The place was rustic, wonderfully simple. All was wood, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. There were 3 ancient carved wooden chairs gathered around a low table off in an alcove at one side of the room. Grandmother led them down a hallway to the back of the place. They passed a room on the left, its screen shut. At the next room, the old lady slid open the panel and said, "The toilet." Farther on, they came to 2 rooms, one on either side of the hallway. She let them know who was to occupy which by mere nods of her head. "The bath is at the end of the hall," she said. Their rooms were tatami style, straw mats and a platform bed with a futon mattress in the far corner. They undressed, put on robes and sandals, and met in the hallway. As they passed through the main room of the house, Ono stirred from his spot by the fireplace, looked up at them, and snorted. "Oh, easy, easy," said Riku to the creature. He stepped aside and let Miki get in front of him. Once out on the porch, she said, "Ono is a little scary." "Only a little?" he asked. Grandmother appeared from within the plot of dying sunflowers and called that there were towels in the shed out by the spring. Riku waved to her as he and Miki took the slate path into the pines. Shadows were rising beneath the trees and the sky was losing its last blue to an orange glow. Leaves littered the path, and the temperature had dropped. The scent of pine was everywhere. Curlews whistled from the branches above. "Are you taking notes?" he called ahead to her. She stopped and waited for him. "Which do you think is more autumnal? The leaves, the dying sunflowers, or Grandmother Chinatsu?" "Too early to tell," he said. "I'm withholding judgment." Another 100 yards down the winding path, they came upon the spring nearly surrounded by pines except for one spot, with a view of a small meadow beyond. Steam rose from the natural pool, curling up in the air, reminding Miki of the white flames of the old lady's jacket. At the edge of the water, closest to the slate path, there was ancient stonework, a crude bench, a stacked rock wall covered with moss, 6 foot by 4, from which a thin waterfall splashed down into the rising heat of the onsen. "Lovely," said Miki. Riku nodded. She left him and moved down along the side of the spring. He looked away as she stepped out of her sandals and removed her robe, which she hung on a nearby branch. He heard her sigh as she entered the water. When he removed his robe, her face was turned away, as if she were taking in the last light of the meadow. Meanwhile, Riku was taking Miki in, her slender neck, her long black hair, and how it lay on the curve of her shoulder, and her breasts. "Are you getting in?" she asked. He silently eased down into the warmth. When Miki turned to look at him, she immediately noticed the tattoo on his right shoulder, a vicious swamp eel with rippling fins and needle fangs and a long body that wrapped around Riku's back. It was the color of the moss on the rocks of the waterfall. Riku noticed her glancing at it. He also noticed the smoothness of her skin, and her nipples were erect. "Who is your employer?" she asked. "He's a good man," he said, and lowered himself into a crouch so that only his head was above water. "Now, pay attention," he said, and looked out at the meadow, which was already in twilight. "To what?" she asked, also sinking down into the water. He didn't respond, and they remained immersed for a long time, just two heads floating on the surface, staring silently and listening, steam rising around them. At last light, when the air grew cold, the curlews lifted from their branches and headed for Australia. Riku stood, moved to a different spot in the spring, and crouched down again. Miki moved closer to him. A breeze blew through the pines. A cricket sang in the dark. "Was there any inspiration?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "It's time for you to tell me your story of autumn." She drew closer to him, and he backed up a step. "I don't tell stories," he said. "As brief as you want, but something," she said, and smiled. He closed his eyes and said, "Okay. The autumn I was 17, I worked on one of the fishing boats out of Numatsu. We were out for horse mackerel. On one journey, we were struck by a rogue wave, a giant that popped up out of nowhere. I was on deck when it hit, and we were swamped. I managed to grab a rope, and it took all of my strength not to be drawn overboard. The water was so cold and powerful. I was sure I would die. 2 men did get swept away, and they were never found. That was my natural history of autumn." She moved forward and put her arms around him. They kissed. He drew his head back and whispered in her ear, "When I returned to shore that autumn, I quit fishing." She laughed and rested her head on his shoulder. They dined by candlelight in their robes in the alcove off the main room of the farmhouse. Grandmother Chinatsu served and Ono followed a step behind, so that every time she leaned forward to put a platter on the table, there was the dog's leering face, tongue drooping. The main course was thin slices of raw mackerel with grated ginger and chopped scallions. They drank sake. Miki remarked on the appearance of the mackerel after Riku's story. "Most definitely a sign," he said. They discussed the things they each saw and heard at the spring as the sake bottle emptied. It was well past midnight when the candle burned out, when they went down the hall to his room. 3 hours later, Miki woke in the dark, still a little woozy from the sake. Riku woke when she sat up on the edge of the bed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I have to use the toilet." She got off the bed and lifted her robe from the mat. Slipping into it, she crossed the room. When she slid back the panel, a dim light entered. A lantern, hanging in the center of the hallway ceiling, bathed the corridor in a dull glow. Miki left the panel open and headed up the hallway. Riku lay back and immediately dozed off. It seemed only a minute to him before Miki was back, shaking him by the shoulder to wake up. She'd left the panel open, and he could see her face. Her eyes were wide, the muscles of her jaw tense, a vein visibly throbbing behind the pale skin of her forehead. She was breathing rapidly, and he could feel the vibration of her heartbeat. "Get me out of here," she said in a harsh whisper. "What's wrong?" he said, and moved quickly to the edge of the bed. She kneeled on the mattress next to him and grabbed his arm tightly with both hands. "We've got to leave," she said. He shook his head and ran his fingers through his hair. It wasn't perfect anymore. He carefully removed his arm from her grip and checked his watch. "It's 3 a.m., he said. "You want to leave?" "I demand that you take me out of this place, now." "What happened?" he asked. "Either you take me now, or I will leave on foot." He gave a long sigh and stood up. I'll be ready in a minute," he said. She went across the corridor to her room and gathered her things together. When they met in the hallway, bags in hand, he asked her, "Do you think I should let Grandmother Chinatsu know we're leaving?" "Definitely not," she said, on the verge of tears. She grabbed him with her free hand and dragged him by the shirt sleeve down the hallway. As they reached the main room of the house, she stopped and looked warily around. "Was it the dog?" he whispered. The coast was apparently clear, for she then dragged him outside, down the porch steps to the silver car. "Get in," he said. "I have to put the top up. It's too cold to drive with it down." "Just hurry," she said, stowing her overnight bag. She slid into the passenger seat just as the car top was closing. He got in behind the wheel and reached over to latch the top on her side before doing his. Miki's window was down, and she heard the creaking of planks from the porch. She leaned her head toward her shoulder and looked into the car's side mirror. There, in the full moonlight, she could see Grandmother Chinatsu and Ono. The old lady was waving and laughing. "Drive!" she shrieked. Riku hit the start button, put the car in gear, and they were off into the night, racing down a rutted dirt road at 50. Once the farmhouse was out of sight, he let up on the gas. "You've got to tell me what happened," he said. She was shivering. "Just get us out of the woods first," she said. "To a highway?" "I can't see a thing. I don't remember all the roads," he said. "We might end up lost." He drove for more than an hour before he found a road made of asphalt. His car had been brutalized by the crude paths and branches jutting into the roadway. There would be 100 scratches on his doors. During that entire time, Miki stared ahead through the windshield, breathing rapidly. "We're on the main road. You want to tell me what happened?" he said. "I got up to use the toilet," she said. "And I did. But when I stepped back out into the hallway to return, I heard this horrible grunting noise. I swear it sounded like someone was choking Grandmother Chinatsu to death in her room. I moved alongside the wall to the entrance. The panel was partially open and there was a light inside. The noise had stopped, so I peered in. And there was the shriveled old lady on her hands and knees on the floor, naked. Her forearms were trembling. Her face was bright red. And she was croaking. At first, I thought she was ill, but then I looked up and realized she was engaged in sexual relations.
Grandmother Chinatsu? He said and laughed. Who was the unlucky gentleman?
That disgusting dog!
She was doing it with Ono?
I almost vomited, said Miki. But I could have dealt with it. The worst thing was Ono saw me peering in, and he smiled at me and nodded.
Dogs don't smile, he said.
Exactly, she said. That place is haunted.
Well, I'll figure out where we are eventually and, well, make it back to Numatsu by morning. I'm sorry you were so frightened. The field trip seemed a great success, till then. She took a few deep breaths to calm herself.
Perhaps that was the true spirit of autumn, she said.
A story of a ghost, he said.
The silver car sped along in the moonlight.
Miki was leaning against the window, her eyes closed.
Riku thought he was heading for the coast.
He took a tight turn on a narrow mountain road and something suddenly lunged out of the woods at the car. He felt an impact as he swerved, turning back just in time to avoid the drop beyond the lane he'd strayed into.
Miki woke at the impact and said, "What's happening?"
I think I grazed a deer back there. I've got to pull over and check to see if the car's okay."
Miki leaned forward and adjusted the rearview mirror so she could look out the back window.
Too late to see. It was a half-mile back. He eased down on the brake, slowing, and began to edge over toward the shoulder.
"There's something chasing us," she said. "I can see it in the moonlight. Keep going! Go faster!"
He downshifted and took his foot off the brake. As he hit the gas, he reached up and moved the mirror out of her grasp so he could see what was following them.
"It's a dog," they said.
"Oh, but it's the fastest dog I ever saw.
I'm doing 45 and it's gaining on us."
They passed through an area where overhanging trees blocked the moon.
"Watch the road," she said.
When the car moved again into the moonlight, he checked behind them and saw nothing. Then they heard loud growling. Each searched frantically to see where the noise was coming from. Swerving out of his lane, Riku looked out his side window and down and saw the creature running alongside, the movement of its 4 legs a blur, its face perfectly human.
"Kuso! Open the glove compartment! There's a gun in there! Give it to me!" "A gun? Hurry!"
he yelled. She did as he instructed, handing him the sleek 9mm.
"You were right," he said. "The place was haunted."
He lowered his side window, switched hands between gun and wheel. Then, steadying himself, he hit the brake. The dog looked up as it sped past the car, a middle-aged woman's face, bitter, with a terrible underbite and a beauty mark beneath the left eye, riding atop the neck of a mangy gray mutt with a naked tail. As soon as it moved a foot ahead of the car, Riku thrust the gun out the window and fired. The creature suddenly exploded, turning instantly to a shower of salt.
"It had a face," he said,
maneuvering the car out of its skid.
"A woman's face." "Don't stop," she said. "Please."
"Don't worry."
"Now," she said, "who is your employer? Why would he send you to such a place?"
Maybe if I tell you the truth, it'll lift whatever curse we're under."
"What is the truth?"
My employer is a very powerful businessman, and I have heard it said that he is also an onmyoji. You know him, In a moment of weakness, he told you a story about an affair he had. Afterward, he worried that you might be inclined to blackmail him. If the story got out, it would be a grave embarrassment for him both at home and at the office. He told me, spend time with her. They wanted me to judge what type of person you are. And if I'm the wrong kind of person, I'm to kill you and make it look like an accident, he said. Are you trying to scare me to death? You and the old woman? No, I swear. I'm as frightened as you are. And I couldn't harm you. Believe me, I know you would never blackmail him. She rested back against the car seat and closed her eyes. She could feel his hand grasp hers. Do you believe me? He said. In the instant she opened her eyes, he saw ahead through the windshield 2 enormous dogs step onto the highway 30 yards in front of the car. Watch out! She screamed. He'd been looking over at her. He hit the brake before even glancing to the windshield. The car locked up and skidded, the headlights illuminating 2 faces. A man with a thin, black mustache and wire-frame glasses, whose mouth was gaping open, and a little girl, chubby, with black bangs, tongue sticking out. On impact, the front of the car crumpled, the airbags deployed, and the horrid dogs burst into salt. The car left the road and came to a stop on the right-hand side, just before the tree line. Riku remained conscious through the accident. He undid his seatbelt and slid out of the car, brushing glass off his shirt. His forehead had struck the rearview mirror, and there was a gash on his right temple. He heard growling, and, pushing himself away from the car, he headed around to Miki's side. A small, pot-bellied dog with the face of an idiot, sunken eyes and swollen lower lip was drooling and scratching at Miki's window. Riku aimed, pulled the trigger, and turned the monstrosity to salt. He opened the passenger door. Miki was just coming around. He helped her out and leaned her against the car. Bending over, he reached into the glove compartment and found an extra clip for the gun. As he backed out of the car, he heard them coming up the road, a pack of them, speeding through the moonlight, howling and grunting. He grabbed her hand and they made for the tree line. "Not the woods," she said, and tried to free herself from his grasp. "No, there's no place to hide on the road. Come on!" They fled into the darkness beneath the trees, Riku literally dragging her forward. Low branches whipped their faces and tangled Miki's hair. Although ruts tripped them, they miraculously never fell. The baying of the beasts sounded only steps behind them. But when he turned and lifted the gun, he saw nothing but night. Eventually, they broke from beneath the trees onto a dirt road. Both were heaving for breath, and neither could run another step. She'd twisted an ankle and was limping. He put one arm around her to help her along. She was trembling. So was he. "What are they?" she whispered. "Jinmenken," he said. "Huh, impossible." They walked slowly down the road, and, stepping out from beneath the canopy of leaves, the moonlight showed them, 100 yards off, a dilapidated building with boarded windows. "I can't run anymore," he said. "We'll go in there, find a place to hide." She said nothing. They stood for a moment on the steps of the place, a concrete structure, some abandoned factory or warehouse, and he tried his cell phone. "No reception," he said, After dialing 3 times and listening, he flipped to a new screen with his thumb and pressed an app icon. The screen became a flashlight. He turned it forward, held it at arm's length, and motioned with his hand for Miki to get close behind him. With a gun at the ready, they moved slowly through the doorless entrance. The place was freezing cold and pitch black. As far as he could tell, there were hallways laid out in a square with small rooms off to either side. "An office building in the middle of the woods?" she said. Each room had the remains of a Western-style door at its entrance, pieces of shattered wood hanging on by the hinges. When he shone the phone's light into the rooms, he saw a window opening boarded from within by a sheet of plywood and an otherwise empty concrete expanse. They went down one hall and turned left into another. Miki remembered she had the same app on her phone and lit it. Halfway down that corridor, they found a room whose door was mostly intact but for a corner at the bottom where it appeared to have been kicked in. Riku inspected the knob and whispered, "There's a lock on this one." They went in, and he locked the door behind them and tested its strength. "Get in the corner, under the window," he said. "If they find us and the door won't hold, I can rip off the board above us and we might be able to escape outside." She joined him in the corner and they sat, shoulders touching, their backs against the cold concrete. "We're sure to be safe when the sun rises." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. Then neither said a word or made a sound. They turned off their phones and listened to the dark. Time passed, yet when Riku checked his watch, it read only 3:30. Well, that in a half hour? He wondered. Then there came a sound, a light tapping, as if rain was falling outside. The noise slowly grew louder, and seconds later, it became clear that it was the sound of claws on the concrete floor. That light tapping eventually became a clatter, as if 100 of the creatures were circling impatiently in the hallway. A strange, guttural voice came from the holes at the bottom corner of the door. "Tomodachi," it said. "Let us in." Riku flipped the flashlight app and held the gun up. Across the room, the hole in the bottom of the door was filled with a fat, pale, bearded face. One eye was swollen shut, and something oozed from the corner of it. The forehead was too high to see a hairline. The thing snuffled and smiled. "Shoot," said Miki. Riku fired, but the face flinched away in an instant. And once the bullet went wide and drilled a neat hole in the door, the creature returned and said, "Tomodachi." "What do you want?" said Riku, his voice cracking. "We are hunting the spirit of the living," said the creature, the movements of its lips out of sync with the words it spoke. "What have we done?" said Miki. "Oh, our hunger is great, but we only require one spirit. We only take what we need. The other person will be untouched. One spirit will feed us for a week." Miki stood up and stepped away from Riku. He also got to his feet. "What are you doing?" she said. "Shoot them." She quickly lit her phone and shone it on him. Instead of aiming the gun at the door, he aimed it at her. "I'm not having my spirit devoured," he said to her. "You said you couldn't hurt me." "It Won't be me hurting you, he said. She saw there were tears in his eyes. The hand that held the gun was wobbling. I'm giving you the girl, he called to the Jinmenkin. Oh, a true benefactor, said the face at the hole. No, she said. What have I done? I'm going to shoot her in the leg so she can't run. Then, I'm going to let you all in. You will keep your distance from me, or I'll shoot. I have an extra clip, and I'll turn as many of you to salt as I can before you get to me. Turning to Miki, he said, I'm so sorry. I did love you. But you're a coward. You don't have to shoot me in the leg, she said. I'll go to them on my own. My spirit's tired of this world. She moved forward and gave him a kiss. Her actions disarmed him, and he appeared confused. At the door, she slowly undid the lock on the knob. Then, with a graceful, fluid motion, she pulled the door open and stepped behind it, against the wall. Take him, he heard her call. The Jinmenkin bounded in, dozens of them, small and large, stinking of rain, slobbering, snapping, clawing. He pulled the trigger till the gun clicked empty and the room was filled with smoke and flying salt. His hands shook too much to change the clip. One of the creatures tore a bloody chunk from his left calf and he screamed. Another went for his groin. The face of Grandmother Chinatsu appeared before him and devoured his. The following week, in a private room at the Limit, Miki sat at a blonde wood table, staring out the open panel across the room at the pines and the coast. Riku's employer sat across from her. Ingenious. The natural history of autumn, he said. And you knew this would draw him in? She turned to face the older man. He was a unique person, she said. Too bad for Riku, he said. I wanted to trust him. Really, the lengths to which you'll go to test the spirit of those you need to trust. He's gone because he was a coward. A coward I can tolerate. But he said he loved you, and it proved he didn't understand love at all. A dangerous flaw. He took an envelope from within his suit jacket and laid it on the table. A job well done, he said. She lifted the envelope and looked inside. A cold breeze blew into the room. You know, he said, this season always reminds me of our time together. As she spoke, she never stopped counting the bills. All I remember of that, she said, is the snow.
One. I have never been a superstitious man, and can honestly say that I do not believe in vampires, ghouls, demons, or anything else that those youngsters with their vivid imaginations and smartphones like to dream up. But there is one thing that happened a very long time ago that still haunts me to this day. I do not know whether I dreamt the whole thing or not, and it has plagued me for 70 long years. Memories are a funny thing, and I admit they are subject to mythologizing. As we grow old, our childhood recollections betray us. They blur and fade, and often all we are left with are these fragmented shards of the original events. But this memory is as clear as the morning sun to me. What I'm about to tell you, I have never told anyone before. It is up to whoever reads this whether you believe me or not. Every time I close my eyes, I see his horrifying visage clearer and clearer, looming up out of the depths of my mind like some grotesque phantom. His pale face perched there in the gloom of that forest still sends icy shivers down my neck. I am an old man now and probably only have a few more years left here. The eternal darkness of the afterlife is all that awaits me, and I think it would be some form of sin to leave this earth without at least telling people what I saw and what I did. It all happened in Dartmoor, England. It was 1948. I was a young lad then, 10 years old. I grew up in a small town called Princetown. It was the only town right in the center of over 300 square miles of nothing but wild, open moorlands and deep river valleys. Dartmoor was always an eerie and isolated place. I knew this even when I was a boy. It was a place where the secrets of nature were still unknown to the residents, and everything beyond the town seemed to be shrouded in a kind of permanent mist. Generations of our family had lived and died right there in Princetown, most of them never even leaving the county lines. And the last of our family line was only me, my mother, younger brother, and father, living in a small white rundown cottage about 4 miles down from Princetown. Let me tell you, Dartmoor did not look like it does now. Back then, it was even more rugged and barren. There were few paved roads, and most houses in the town were nothing more than bleak, moldering terrace houses, squatting there in the perpetual bog. Slates roofs and old masonry walls with small square windows on each face. Rows of them sheltering quiet, hard-working families who'd huddle around their wood stoves together at night. During the day, curtains would twitch, and you could sometimes catch glimpses of the solitary hermits who had been living there for decades. The town only really existed because of the prison that was built up there on the damp rolling moors sometime back in the 17th century. And even then, the prison itself was ironically only built there because it would have been harder for the prisoners to escape. Princetown was like some lonely bastion or frontier town set up high in the hills. Most of Dartmoor around it was deep pine woods and marshland, long dark places filled with deer and other things that crept around nervously in the trees. This was before pylons carved their way across the lands, and those great metal eagles were seldom seen in the skies. Before most of the forests were cut down by the Forestry Commission, there was a lot of room for secrets. One of them I met. My dad was a prison warden at HMP Dartmoor. He would work 15-hour shifts, and I rarely saw him, if I'm honest. So for the majority of my childhood, it was just me and my mother. She worked at the Plume of Feathers pub there in Princetown. She was a barmaid, and every night she would put me to sleep at 7 before heading off to work. I spent a lot of time on my own, and as a result, had to entertain myself. I would often play with my little wooden trucks down in the meadows at the back of our house. And when both parents were working, I'd stay up by candlelight and read dictionaries and encyclopedias. I was quite a dull kid, if I'm being honest. If my wife were still alive now, she would tell you I have never had an imagination and am one of the least creative people you would ever meet. Anyway, I'd just turned 10 and was getting used to the idea of being an only child. But then Elfie was born. Little Elfie. He was such a sweet baby. One day my mother came into my bedroom and sat me on the bed. She took my hand, told me I would have a baby brother soon. I hugged her and she told me nothing would change and I would still be her eldest son. At first I was excited at the prospect of having someone to play with and someone to look after. But after he was born, things changed. I couldn't help but notice how much they doted on him. It felt like I was unceremoniously pushed aside. It began to burn inside me. That idle neglection soon gave way to jealousy. I didn't know why, but I started to dislike Elfie. Whenever he would giggle and kick his little legs, I would roll my eyes and leave the room. Not that my mom or my dad would notice me leave. They were too enamored with how cute Elfie was to take interest in me anyway. To this day, I do not know why I let it happen. The logical reason would have been a fit of deep jealousy, but I know that's not what I was thinking at the time. To tell you the truth, I wasn't really thinking at all. It was early evening, a sultry hot evening in July. I was giving my mother a hand with bathing Elfie. I would pass her the soap and such as she gently bathed and scrubbed giggling little Elfie. His head was half submerged in the water, and he looked up at me and her and smiled. He had bright blue eyes and wispy blonde hair. A cheeky rounded face framed his fat little grin. Babies have spent most of their lives in liquid, so it was no surprise why he was so happy and comfortable bobbing there in the warm soapy water. He must have thought he was back in our mum's womb all over again. I didn't know why his smile bothered me so much. Maybe I saw it as a smirk and that he knew what he was doing. I thought he was mocking me. At one point, my mother mentioned that she had to get ready for work. She stood up and asked me to hold on to Elfie for a few minutes while she brushed her hair. So I did. I put my arm down and held the back of his head gently. His piercing aqua blue eyes looked right into me. He waved his arms excitedly and chuckled, spewing water from his mouth as he did. He was such a sweet baby. It was then that I decided I needed to get a towel to dry him off. My mother didn't have long before she had to leave for work, and we had to dry him down before putting him to bed. So I sat him upright in the bath and left the room. Then, without thinking, I went and sat on the end of my bed and waited. I don't know why I did that. A few minutes later, I heard my mother's screaming echo down the hallway, this agonizing weeping that made me shudder. "No!" she bellowed. "Elfie, no, God, no!" She screamed that over and over. She then burst into my room holding Elfie. He was no longer giggling. His pale, lifeless body hung from her grip like he was a wet towel. "What did you do?" she screeched at me. "What did you do?" I couldn't say anything. There was a thick, squelching lump in my throat, stopping me from talking, and I couldn't even look at her. My skin tingled and I felt sick. All I was thinking was, "Liam, why did you do that? Why did you let him drown?" My mum cried and sobbed. She hugged his body tight to hers, tears streaming down her red face. She then closed her eyes and went quiet. And so did I. It was worse when my dad came back. The police and the ambulance came with him. Elfie was pronounced dead at the scene. The police interrogated me while my mum sobbed into my dad's arms in the background. The detective asked what I did, and I could only reply, "I went to get a towel for him. I'm sorry." When the police left, my dad beat me. I didn't even try stopping him. I knew I deserved it. That night destroyed my family. A month later, my father left us. He didn't say anything to me before he did. 2. All of that happened 6 years before I met the thing in the trees. The year was 1954. After Elfie died and my father had left, it was just me and my mother in that lonely, decaying cottage together. My mum had fallen into the bottle and only acknowledged me when she needed me to do the chores or fetch her more booze. I had noticed in that time she was staying late after her shifts, seeing men, and she had begun to look ill. Her skin was sickly and sallow and her eyes always gray and sunken. My mother was always a pretty woman, and it was hard to watch her slow descent, knowing I had caused it all. It was late one night in January, and I was about to go to bed when I heard the familiar slurring demands echoing from down the hall after me. "Boy," she crowed. Since Elfie's death, she refused to call me by my Christian name. "Go to the general store and..." Get me the big bottle of brandy they have. If you leave now, you still make it." I had no choice but to oblige. If I didn't get her what she asked for, then she would have no doubt thrown me out onto the damn squalid streets. I don't need to tell you how well a boy of 16 would have fared back then. So I rose from my bed, changed into my winter gear, and put on my blue parka coat that I had outgrown 2 years previously. I came into what was our living room, and she was there, lying across the only sofa in a decrepit heap of drunkenness, clumps of mold accumulating in the corners of the room around her. The radio crackled in the background, playing some old-timey tune that I can't recall now. From the crumpled sofa, she tossed me some tattered notes and told me to hurry up. She was already half asleep at this point, so I was unsure why she needed any more booze. I picked it up all the same, and I left. I shut the door behind me and headed out into the freezing night. It was bitterly cold, and my breath came out in thick white plumes that rose up and vanished into the vacuous black sky. I stood there on our porch, the dull amber lamp above twitching nervously, and I thought briefly about what I should do. It was a 4-mile walk to Princetown if I followed the main road, but a 2-mile walk if I took a shortcut through the forest that ran adjacent to it. I don't know why I decided to cut through the forest that night. I guess in my mind I just wanted to get it over with so I could go to sleep sooner. I was already employed at Plymouth Docks as a laborer and had to cycle 10 miles to the yard every day. Walking 8 miles at almost 10 o'clock at night was not the type of rest I needed. So I went with the latter. After all, I had played in that forest when I was 10 years old. I had walked through it during the day multiple times, and I guess I felt pretty confident that I could navigate it just as competently in the dead of night. With a plan in mind, I set off and headed for the woods. I could barely see it in the distance, but I knew it was there. I knew you could get to Princetown quicker from our house by way of that thin and muddy pathway that cut across a field and eventually a part of the pine forest called Wistman's Wood. But it would be much harder at night. Foolishly, that was what I decided to do. It was a gloomy copse of stunted moss-covered pedunculate oak trees shrouding the epiphytic undergrowth and boggy rock-strewn floor. After a short walk down the muddy path, I came to it. The stretch of woods was supposedly haunted. A few centuries back, there were rumors of witch trials in there. Pagans, Celtic shamans, and other heretics used to flock and conduct ceremonies at night when the moon was swollen and gibbous. People and farm animals alike had gone missing over the years, and if you could go there today, you can still see the strange, archaic ruins carved into the lichen-covered boulders that sit scattered in the gnarled and ancient oak-wood forest. But that wasn't why people today still say it is haunted. There was something else in there. Of course, at the time I had heard of the old folk tale of the thing in the trees, but I took no notice of it. The aspects of the story seemed just so juvenile to me that I dismissed the whole thing as some old camper's tale told around the bonfire to warm their cockles. With a wry shrug of the shoulders, I headed into the trees. The sooner I got through it, the sooner I could get back. The trees started low to the ground on the outskirts. I had to duck under a few of the branches to make any kind of headway. It was a dark night anyway, but once I stepped into the woods, I realized just how dark things could get. I could barely see 5 feet in front of my face, resigning myself instead to feeling and pushing through the damp mossy branches that scraped across my cheeks. It must have been about 40 minutes when I made it through the fabled Wistman's Wood and then into the deep brooding pine forest behind it. At this point, I began to feel scared. The walk was taking too long. I'd begun to lose my sense of direction. The trees were tall and looming above me, and everything was deathly silent in there. Not even the owls were howling. It was as if the woodland critters were too terrified to make their presence known. But that wasn't what was scaring me. Instead, it felt like there was something watching me. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt this hungry, hot stare on my back. But every time I turned to try and see what it was, there was nothing there. Just the rows of silent trees. An impenetrable wall of black seemed to surround me and creep in closer when I wasn't looking. It must have been another hour when I finally realized I didn't know which direction I was heading in anymore. I tried to spot the faint amber lights of Princetown glowing in the distance, but I couldn't see a thing. I didn't hear anything either, just the same unrelenting, heaving darkness of the never-ending forest. Still, there was this presence near me. It was like a shadow was walking too close behind me. When I'd passed the 2-hour mark was when I began to fear for my life. I quietly wondered whether I'd ever find my way out again. If I didn't, would my mother even notice? Would anyone come looking for me? In a panic, I called out, "Hello, is anyone there? I'm lost." Nothing. Not a sound. The branches on the trees weren't even swaying. Everything was deathly still and unnervingly silent. I was truly lost and alone. I continued walking for what felt like days. My stomach was rumbling and my legs began to ache with the constant timid stepping over the rocks and fallen trees. At one point, I leaned against a tree and buried my head in my forearm, thinking hard about what I should do. I'd called out a few more times but still heard nothing back. The nighttime air was freezing my joints and making my exposed skin go numb. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine myself in front of a warming fire or wrapped up back in my bedsheets. Then, as I dreamed of roaring stove fires and comfy sofas, I heard something come from behind me.
"Leon, Princetown is this way,"
it whispered softly. My eyes bulged open and I darted around to face it. Numbing fear gripped me, but when I peered back into the darkness, there was nothing. "Hello? Is someone there?" I asked quietly, trying not to sound scared. Was the tale true after all? I thought. Then coming from my right side now.
"You have to hurry, or Mommy will throw you away."
The voice sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. It was hoarse and guttural, but also had a bizarre echoing timbre to it. "Hello?" I shouted this time. "Please, I'm lost and I'm cold."
"Not as cold as Elfie,"
the strange metallic voice chuckled from between the branches. I shuddered and looked around. My first thought was, how the hell do they know about my baby brother? "Who's that out there?" I begged. My voice was trembling. Then I heard something emanating through the trees that made my skin run cold. Slowly, rising out of the ruddy darkness of the forest, I heard a baby crying. A feeble wailing that only babies can do. It cried and cried, the noise of it all rising into a crescendo around me. I looked up and tried to pinpoint where exactly the sound was coming from, but it was too hard to tell. "Please, sir, I need to get out of here," I said. After a few moments of the baby crying, I heard that horrible alien voice once more.
"Follow the baby, and you will get out."
So I did. The noise of the cry distilled and focused in one direction. I started chasing after it. As I climbed over the dead, decaying branches and through the cold leaves, I thought of Elfie again. How did this person know about Elfie? I wondered. As I moved deeper into the woods, I began to hear another sound. It was unmistakable to me, a sound impossible to forget. I heard my mother's agonizing wails the night Elfie died. That sound was etched into my mind forever, and I heard it all over again in the center of the long dark woods that I couldn't escape. Without warning, I began to howl. The noises of baby Alfie crying and my mother keening assailed my ears and made me break down. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry," I shouted in reply, but they continued crying and sobbing in the blackness. "Please, Mom, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." They didn't stop, so I wiped the tears from my blistered face and continued walking. I didn't know what direction I was heading in, but at that point, it didn't seem to matter anymore. 3. For what felt like days, I continued wandering around in the darkness, all of it an endlessly repeating cycle of tree trunks and gulches, hills and moss-covered stones. I was so sick of it all. I was so tired that I couldn't even lift my head to glance forward at my plight. Instead, just this relentless stream of moss and puddles drifted below my feet. The air was raw and wretched against my skin. The icy clasp of death seemed to be clawing its way under my coat now. I was beyond cold. The ghosts of my past's crying had subsided. I only heard them faintly in the distance now. I continued walking. I walked and walked. Then my feet began to slow and drag across the primal earth. I began to stumble. Soon I wasn't walking anywhere. I remember this part clearest of all. I then conceded defeat and sat down at the base of a giant ancient pine tree and just stared off into the inky darkness, almost accepting my fate now. I sighed and leant back. The bark of the tree scraped against my legs and back, and the earth below me was much colder than the air, but I didn't care anymore. I thought I was going to die in there. In a strange and morbid kind of way, I felt like I had deserved it. The moldering earth decaying and absorbing me until not even my bones remained. The memory of what I had done, no more. The night drew on and I felt my extremities slowly fade into absence. The frost and air made everything retreat into numbness, and with the chilling embrace of the night, my young mind began to leave me too. I couldn't think straight. I sat there in the dirt and stared ahead into the abyss of the primordial forest. All those trees bearing down upon me, reaching out to embrace me as one of their own. And there, just as I began lulling in and out of consciousness, I saw something ahead of me. Against the flat darkness, an almost imperceptible shape lingered. I squinted at first, unsure of what I was looking at. Then I blinked slowly and tried to focus on it. The frost on my eyelashes stung like bee stings, and everything in my body was shutting down. But still, I saw something there. It was a tall and pale figure there amidst the knee-high grass and lichens. It was looking right at me, but it didn't look with eyes. I felt its gaze. It took on the form of a person, but it couldn't have been. It was too tall, at least 7 feet. It was wearing a long dark robe, like a Jesuit priest, draped over its emaciated body. It was hard to tell, but I thought I saw 4 arms crawling and scrabbling around under its shroud. The thing had no face. Instead, just this rounded surface, like the shell of a rotten egg. Around the jowls of the face was drooping pallid skin that looked like drained chicken fillets. There were no eyes, no features, except a thin black slit running down the center of its skull. I was gripped in a kind of dull paralysis and my heart thundered in my ribcage. I stared forward at it, poised against the bracken and pine needles. As I look back now, I believe it was Death himself that I met that night. I believe he came to take me, but it was not my time, it seemed. I was so enervated of strength that I could not hold my eyes open any longer. Everything faded. The thing came towards me, looming up out of the lightlessness of this horrible night. It didn't walk. It had no feet. It came gliding at me, hovering just off the ground. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I couldn't move anything. Unconscious fear became an unassailable reality. As it drew nearer, I realized my body was shutting down. Then I sunk down into something abyssal. I felt the world falling away from me. In the deepest pit of blackness, I had only a vague awareness of my utter terror. But death never came for me. Something else did. 4. Sometime later, I awoke in a daze and felt curiously warm somehow. My thoughts were fuzzy and I couldn't focus properly. Surely, slowly, my eyes blinked open for the first time in a long time, and I looked around. It wasn't the forest anymore. I was somewhere else now. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw that I was on my back, laying on a sofa of sorts. There was a thick sheep's wool blanket draped over me, and I couldn't move any of my arms or legs. I was inside now. The room I was in was glowing with warmth. Candles twinkled on the windowsills, and the floor was made from this thick oak that seemed to absorb the light from them. In the corner of the room, crackling away, was a roaring stove fire. The flames rolled and danced over the logs in the peripheries of my sight. It was all a miasma of heat and scents. It smelt like matches and copper in there. I tried to rise from the bed but stopped myself when I noticed a huge figure sitting on a stool by the fire before me. Is that him? The thing in the trees? I thought. The shadow of its bulk cast across the floor towards me. Fear gripped me once more, and I didn't make a sound that would alert it to my awakeness. I laid there, looking across at it, unmoving, unsure of what to do. It had those same dark robes that draped over its immense stature. The thing looked like a grizzly bear hunched over in a duvet. It had its back to me, and at regular intervals I observed the thick tobacco-smelling wafts rising from its hood. "No need to pretend," the figure said in a warm, mellow voice. "I know you're with us now." "Where am I?" I asked after a long, hushed pause. "Where you always wanted to be." "Where's that?" It never looked at me. It just stared into the flames of the wood burner and sucked away sullenly on its pipe. After a drawn-out silence, it craned ever so slightly towards me and said, "You have carried something for a long time. What is it?" I saw no point in lying anymore. I knew what he was talking about. If it were the same thing from between the trees, and I believe it was, then he already knew about Elfie, about what I did. So after a teary gulp, I spoke. "I did something very bad," I muttered. "What?" it asked with a shrewd air of wisdom. I shook my head and stared into the threnody of flames burning up all the wood and coal. "I let my brother drown," I said. "He was only 6 months old. I don't know why I did that. I didn't dislike him. I actually—" The thing cocked its head to the right and blew out a big cloud of acrid smoke. "How?" "He was in the bath. I was supposed to be keeping an eye on him, but—" "And what did you do?" I bit my tongue hard before speaking. Then, "I left the bathroom. I left him," I said as I felt my voice grow tight. "Then what?" "I let him drown." It was hard to tell, but it looked like the thing sat in front of the fire had nodded in acknowledgement. "What do you feel?" it said earnestly. My skin tingled and I felt my face well up with tears. They poured out like 2 scarring waterfalls from my eyes. "Just want my brother back." "Even if that means that you die?" "Yes, I don't care. I just want him back. I want to tell him I'm sorry. I never wanted him gone. "Yes?" "I didn't want to be overlooked." Then there was quiet in the room. The fire rolled away and everything was silent once more. The thing by the fire bowed its head. "You look very tired, little boy. You should close your eyes," it said. After a long pause, I asked, "Who are you?" We knew each other once, although we never truly got to know each other. Close your eyes. Sleep. I had wanted to ask him more, but as soon as he said that sentence, it was like being given a warm cup of milk. My eyes drooped and my body relaxed. My eyes shut and I felt the most comfortable I have ever been. I soon fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. Thoughts and dreams rolled over me like waves on an eternal beach. 5. I woke up with sunlight in my eyes, slanting its way through the trees and onto my face. As I opened them slowly, its blinding glare filtered into my vision, and I found myself awake once more. My head pounded and I felt vaguely nauseous, but I was alive. I rubbed my furrowed brows in confusion and tried to coax the sleep from my eyes. When I leaned up wearily and looked around, I saw that I was still in the dreaded forest. But it was different now. It was the morning. My sight adjusted to the bitter sun rays and I could see the edge of the forest. In fact, I was a mere 10 feet away from the main road that led into Princetown. The relief shot through me and I almost started crying again. More than anything, I was just glad to see the end and be free of the awful trees. Frost sparkled on all the grass and the brisk morning breeze was cool and refreshing against my skin. I got up, dusted the dried and gray mud off myself, and then headed into town. My thoughts were racing. Did I imagine all that? Or did that thing bring me to the edge of the forest? I imagined every conceivable possibility on that walk back into Princetown. When I made it into town, I could see a small congregation of people standing around the town hall. They all looked worried and concerned as they glanced across at each other. Some had the collars of their coats rolled up to shield against the cold winds. One of them turned and spotted me, then said, "He's here." All of them turned to face me and then came rushing towards me. My mother was there with them. She burst into tears when she saw me. She hugged me and said she was sorry. I said I was sorry too. After that, they took me to Plymouth Hospital to make sure I was all right. And I was. Yet I didn't know how exactly. To this day, I cannot say for certain just what happened. All I know is I felt it. I felt like I had met death that night in the dim forest. And if you feel it, then it must be real. That's all I have to say about that. You may make up your own mind whether I'm just a bored old boy trying to pull a fast one on everyone, or if I really did meet death that night long ago. Anyway, we'll leave it there. I'm tired now, and I'm waiting for my carer to bring me my afternoon hot chocolate before I have my nap. I can't stay up late anymore like all them youngsters. You'll understand one day when you're my age. You know, as I have written this, more and more has come back to me. I don't think dying is such a bad thing after all. As I become more senile and infirmity creeps ever closer, I must confess, I am sad to see all of this end. But I'm also optimistic for what lies on the other side of death. I hope Elfie is there. I hope he forgives me.
The truck squealed as it turned the corner, going into a sharp drift that threatened to topple it and everyone inside. Marcus got back control and pushed hard on the accelerator. The speed quickly climbed along the open city street, 50, 60, 70 miles per hour. The sound of sirens was loud behind them, and thankfully, the area was dead at this time of night. Marcus knew if it came to a choice between a pedestrian or stopping, he would choose to hit the pedestrian. He didn't want to, of course, but his freedom meant much more to him than the life of a stranger. The police hadn't turned onto their tail yet, so he once again whipped off to a street on the right. It was just as dark and quiet, and he looked frantically around for a good place to hide until the heat died down some. The gravel road went off down a grassy hill and into an unlit area. Part of his brain knew better. It wasn't a good place to turn around if he needed to. He would essentially be blocking themselves in. But the truck was low on gas, and this would likely be as good a place as he would find. "Hang on, everybody. We're going off-road." He sharply turned off to the right and instantly felt every little bump as the truck careened downward. He shut off the lights as he pulled next to an old building that sat next to an overgrowth of trees and brush. Not quite a forest, but close enough to matter. As the truck slowed and moved off toward the corner of the building, he saw a set of flashing lights drive by. They hadn't caught on to him. Not just yet, anyway. He knew he should try to conceal the truck somehow, but didn't have the time to think about it. Maybe if they got into the building and found an old tarp or something, it would be worth doing, but for now, he and his co-workers got out with their merchandise and frantically looked for a way in. The front doors were locked and boarded up, as were the windows, but Marcus climbed up to one of them and began kicking boards out of the way. Finally, he had enough room to slide in, followed by the other three. The four of them took a moment to take in their surroundings. It was dark, but as their eyes adjusted, they could begin to make out a warehouse. Racks lined the room, mostly empty, others with random boxes. None of it to help their situation. The sound of sirens off in the distance was good. So far, they had made off with about $900,000 in precious gemstones. "Ha! We did it, man!" yelled Connor. "Hell yeah! We're set for life!" echoed Thompson.
"We didn't do shit,"
came the feminine voice from further away. Naples leaned against the wall, listening for sounds of traffic. Connor and Thompson both looked at her incredulously. "What you mean we ain't done shit? We got the goods, we got away from the cops. Now all we gotta do is fence this ice and we split. Real easy," said Thompson, smacking one hand into the other for emphasis. "Yeah. The only real problem now is deciding which bitches get to ride my junk first," said Connor. "Don't be stupid." "She's right, y'all," Marcus iterated. "If by some very slim miracle the police don't find us here, you think they ain't gonna find us when we leave? Not to mention, you ain't gonna have very many bitches for long with that small a payday." "What do you mean? It's almost $1 million, Connor laughed, still wrapped up in his delusion.
"Now divide that by 4, you idiot,"
said Naples. "Fuck you mean to say we risked felony jail time for a measly old quart?" yelled Thompson. "That was the deal from the beginning, asshole. Don't you be getting no remorse just 'cause you're too dumb to see the bigger picture," said Marcus. Thompson began walking up to him, squaring up his shoulders to meet with the older guy. Marcus pulled the pistol out of the back of his pant line, holding it up to his head. The two locked eyes for a while before Thompson chuckled. "I need this shit, man. I'm gonna take what's mine and get me away from your goofy ass." Marcus lowered his gun and let out a breath. Punk. Thompson and Connor began laughing about all the wonderful things they were gonna do. Marcus shook his head and made his way to Naples, who was looking over a pistol. "We need to find a place to stash these just in case we do get busted," he said in a hushed tone.
"Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. I'm not certain about how our odds are of getting out of here, but I wouldn't bet my life on it just yet. If they do catch us, it could be a good way to knock a few years off at least."
"I'm gonna go look upstairs. You look down here. And keep an eye on them while you're at it. I don't trust them." She nodded, and they both made their way to the right side of the building. "You two stay here and keep a lookout. You see anyone walking around here, do not start firing. Understand? You come get me first." "Yeah, sure thing, boss," said Connor. Marcus and Naples looked to each other one last time, and then split up. The stairs led to an office of some kind overlooking both the warehouse as well as a production floor on the other side. Most of the machinery was still there, and assembly lines filled most of the floor. The office itself wasn't overly large. A computerless desk sat toward the back with an old, ripped-up chair still sitting behind it. Useless papers were strewn here and there, forgotten by the passage of time. Something odd stood out, though. To the left of the desk against the wall sat a large trunk. It was half open, and he could just see that it was empty. That wasn't strange on its own, but it looked brand new, not part of the building. Marcus gave it a quick thought and decided to throw the bag of stolen goods inside of it. If the police did come, odds are they would probably find it, but it was better than nothing. After stashing the sack and seeing nothing else of value, he made his way back out and down the stairs. Halfway down, as a second thought, he turned to go close the box and heard it fall shut and click on its own. Maybe older than I thought, he said to himself, and continued down to meet the others. Thompson and Connor saw Marcus approach and also noticed his empty hands. "You ain't holding out on us, are you, bro?" asked Thompson. "Man, don't even worry about it. I stashed him just in case we get caught, eh? You hear anything while I was gone?" "Nah, man. It's been quiet as a grave. Naples is still looking around," said Connor. "Okay. I'm gonna go meet up with her and see what's on the other side. You guys stay sharp." The two nodded, and once again, Marcus turned to the production floor. Once he was through the door, they looked at each other and nodded. Thompson walked as quickly and quietly up the stairs as he could. The two had made a plan to grab the jewels for themselves and make a quick split while Marcus and Naples weren't looking. He took a quick look around, heart thumping in his chest, and noticed the shut box in the corner. He made his way over to lift the lid. There it was, the bag that would change their lives. Grinning, he reached his hand in for it and tried to pull his hand out when he noticed the moisture lining the bottom. His hand wouldn't budge. It was stuck and pulling hard on his skin. Just as he was about to stand, he heard a low growl and saw long, sharp teeth push through the chest's opening. The lid came down hard in his arm, and he screamed as the teeth sank all the way through the skin and meat of his arm. He tried pulling harder, but a long tongue wrapped around what remained of his now destroyed limb and pulled him headfirst in. A few short screams later, and it was silent. His twitching body was slowly pulled further in until all that remained was a bloody carpet. Marcus and Naples were discussing what their next plans should be when they heard it. They both looked up to the windows in the manager's office, but it was too dark. "Fuck!" yelled Marcus. His first thought was that they were caught, but it didn't make sense why someone would be screaming from up there. Then he remembered where he stashed the goddamn gems. "I'm gonna kill that backstabbing son of a..." On the other side of the door stood Connor. He was pale and pointing up the stairs with a shaking hand. Marcus grabbed him by the shirt and shook him violently. "What happened? What the fuck is that asshole doing?" When Connor didn't respond, Marcus smacked him a few times. This seemed to snap him back to the world, and he was finally able to talk. "It was all Thompson, boss. He was talking all crazy about taking everything for himself. I saw him go up, but he screamed, and I ain't seen him since." "Useless asshole," Marcus yelled, throwing him to the ground. Naples was already up and in the room. He met her at the door, and they both looked around. Nothing was out of place except a large amount of blood that was soaking into the green carpet. That and the chest was missing. He looked all around for any possible explanation, and noticed the window leading out to the warehouse was open. There was no possible way for anyone to go out without dropping down about 20 feet. It was possible, but how had he gotten by unnoticed? And why was there so much blood on the floor? It wasn't adding up. "Connor, you sure you didn't come back down these steps?" He nodded dumbly in response. fucking useless, everyone. Okay, Naples, we're gonna split up and find that double-crossing backstabber, and then we're gonna get the hell out of here.
Believe me, when I get a hold of him, there won't be anything left to give a share to.
She growled back. She pulled out her pistol and ran down the stairs. Connor, you go to the other side and look for him. I'm gonna stay up here where I can see everything. If I catch you trying to sneak off with him, you're gonna be just as dead as he's gonna be. Got it? Connor nodded and ran over to the doors going out. He knew something was very wrong here, and that Thompson didn't just flake out on them, but he was glad to be down here and away from that room. At this point, he would have almost welcomed getting arrested. He made his way from assembly line to assembly line, gun rattling in his hand, looking around like a scared little rat. He could swear he heard sounds, some sort of movement he wasn't able to make out. Must have been echoes from the other side of the building. Surely there wasn't anything over on this end. Hell, even if he did find anything, he would just stay out of its way anyway. Much safer. The bathrooms were over here too, and he realized he badly needed to piss. He was surprised his bladder hadn't yet burst. He ran over to the dark room, into the first urinal he could make out. He undid his pants just in time, and the relief was instant. Tears almost seemed to form in the corner of his eyes as he emptied himself. He was so lost in the moment, he didn't hear the low growls coming from the toilet, or the long, dagger-like teeth begin to slide out of the top and bottom of its surface. His joy turned to revulsion as he felt something brush against his leg. He looked down and saw something like a snake with sharp barbs poking out wrap his thigh. He screamed and tried to pull away, but like Thompson, it was like he was superglued to the thing. He gave one hard pull, but it wasn't enough, as the long tongue pulled him back, and daggers of pain shot through Connor's skin. His screams turned to high-pitched wails as the teeth pushed through the meat and bone of his hip. There was no escaping this thing as he fell to the dust-covered floor. He tried to move away, but his lower body no longer followed his commands, and the thing's tongue pulled him closer still. Connor's body was devoured, and the creature's enamel-looking body turned to a blob-like state. Its mass, which was originally so small, filled out and was growing quickly. The gelatinous blob crawled up the walls and through a hole in the ceiling. The door burst open as Marcus ran inside, gun drawn. He looked around but didn't see anything but a nasty old bathroom at a first glance. Then he noticed the dark color in the center of the dust. He reached down and touched it, feeling it was wet. He smelled it, and it had the iron tang of fresh blood. Naples came in behind him, aiming at anything that could be a threat.
You find him?
She asked. Nah. Pretty sure the fool's dead. More blood, but no body, he said, as he stood and pointed his gun toward the dark stains.
Well, I hate to say it, but we better cut all losses and just go if we don't want to end up like them.
She was clearly bitter about the thought of losing close to $1 million. Who could blame her? Her life was much more valuable to her. It might not be so bad if they knew what they were up against here, but with nothing to go on but pure fucking vanishing acts, it would be stupid to wait and find out. Yeah, God, I hate to, but there ain't no way in hell I'm dying in this place. It'll be daylight soon. We ought to get back out front and head south. Nothing but woods once you get toward the edge of the city. Maybe we can make it. With a sigh, she nodded, and they made their way back to the front. Man, I really wish I had a flashlight, Marcus said under his breath.
I know what you mean, but we'd be a walking beacon. Better to move quietly through the dark,
she said in a barely audible tone. They walked to the door, guns drawn, and Naples pushed it open. Through it, she didn't see the warehouse, but another door, exactly like this one.
When were there two doors?
She asked, looking over. Marcus looked just as confused when she noticed her hand was stuck. They also noticed the gleaming white teeth begin to form from around the door in its frame.
Oh shit, Marcus, help!
She pulled hard, but the door wouldn't budge, and its long, fat tongue pushed out and began to encircle her. Marcus fired round after round into the creature. They seemed to do very little, and with his last bullet, he hit what he thought might have been an eye. The creature screeched in pain, and the tongue unraveled around her. She pulled hard and her hand came away, but not without losing a large area of skin from her fingers and palm. They both ran back, and she sent every bullet she had into the creature.
It's not working! What the hell is it?
She yelled, throwing the gun into its now melting body. The form became an amorphous blob once again and rolled toward them, corralling them into a corner. "Climb over them belts!" yelled Marcus, and the two began making their way slowly to the door behind the thing. It was faster than it should have been, and as they climbed over the final line, the blob attached itself to Marcus's leg. "Let go, you fuck!" He desperately pulled and was getting nowhere. The gelatinous form began to make large white teeth, and they sank down just above the knee. He screamed as blood pumped in heavy streams from the severed limb. It went in for another bite, but Naples was able to pull him free. She wrapped an arm around him, and the two went for the front door. She was about to open it when it shot open by itself. "On the ground, now!" A police officer had a flashlight in their eyes and a gun trained directly on them. They got down as best they could, trying to warn them of the monster that was inside, but they were ignored as handcuffs were slapped around their wrists. Naples was taken to the back of a squad car, and they did what they could for Marcus's leg. Detective Norris, who was assigned to the case, pulled up not too long after. "The hell happened to him?" he asked, looking at Marcus's grievous wound. "Not sure. He was raving about some monster and then fainted. Our best guess is they didn't want to split the money and turned on each other. Good thing the gunshots were called in, or we would have never checked out this old place." "Anyone been inside yet?" "Well, we wanted to wait for backup before we cleared it. The other two haven't been apprehended yet. Could get ugly." The sergeant nodded. "Wait here with him until paramedics arrive. You two, I want you to back me up. Everybody clear?" "Yes, sir," they all replied. One of the officers quickly opened the door, and Norris readied his weapon. It was quiet. In a hushed tone, he told them to follow as he walked softly inside. They made their way to the staircase and the ladder that led up to a trap door to the same office. He motioned for them to go up the ladder, and he would take the stairs. Sergeant Norris was no stranger to dangerous situations. This could easily turn bad fast, so he needed to be faster. He moved as silent as possible, while making good time up to the office, weapon ready to take out any threat. He got to the top and found there was none. He looked around the office, seeing no one other than himself. He did notice the blood on the floor, though, still moist, but no trapdoor or entrance in the floor. That's when he heard it. The screams of the other officers coming from below him. In a flash, he was down the stairs and looking at something. He was sure it couldn't be right. The ladder they were on was curling up around both the men. The trapdoor attached to the ceiling was wide open, surrounded with massive white teeth. Saliva dripped down on top of the trapped officers as it slowly pulled them in.
Max came to, in the same bed he'd woken up in all his life, and shortly after began to cry. Considering the way he bolted himself out of bed, an ignorant bystander could have been forgiven for thinking he was a model of efficiency, and be envious of his get-up-and-go attitude. Up and at him. He'd initially bounded out of bed as if he had something to wake up to, the whole time intuiting that something was amiss. His stomach sparked, stirred by some undefined anxiety. Now he remembered. His body and reality were working at cross purposes. There was no reason to propel himself out of bed after all. He was still functionally blind. He still had no life to look forward to. Having been asleep for far longer than he anticipated, he had somehow forgotten the routine. Wake up, ready to go. Recognize something was wrong. Feel a pang of panic upon discovering that the world around him still appeared alien and borderline indecipherable, obscured under a perpetual dim haze. He was still prisoner to otherworldly angles and shapes conjured up by two ruined retinas. Calm himself down by sitting on his bed. Nothing can harm him in his room. Worry about how he would make it through the day, about how he was still dependent upon the mother he despised, surviving on pity like some emotional parasite. Another day to look forward to, spent idling away in his mother's home, her trying her best to talk to him about film or culture or art, intellectual stuff, the type of stuff she knew he used to enjoy. Her observations would be cliched at best, nonsensical at worst. He tried his best to be respectful and appreciate her efforts, but he could never entirely eliminate the dismissive tone in his voice. Preserving his intellectual integrity was the only part of himself that remained unspoiled by his relatively recent myopia. That may not be true, he thought. He hadn't cared about intellectual integrity too much before his retinas both decided to fuck up on him. He used to tolerate and even encourage his mother to seek out interesting books, films, theater, and the like, and had enjoyed hearing her thoughts about them. But now she was his only outlet, and he couldn't stand it. This was what he woke up to, yet again. So he cried, as if whatever caused his retinal problems was just a toxin that could be flushed out with enough tears. When he was done, he reached out and felt for his Coke bottle glasses. These things had cost a fortune, and still they were distractingly thick and always smudgy, all of the anti-reflective coating long come undone. But they helped because once his glasses were on, a world where colors and shapes bled into each other without rhyme or reason became a little easier to take. At best, the world became an impressionistic painting, some forest, no trees. He sometimes joked, to himself, that druggy kids would pay a boatload to experience the trippy sensory experience of navigating through his vision. There was no indication that his mother was home, which was bittersweet. He made his way to the kitchen, slow and steady, using his hands as a guide, all the while suppressing thoughts of how those blind, grubby cave rats get around. That toothy kind that elicit "ews" from all right-thinking people. Feeling around his designated corner of the kitchen, his heart skipped a beat when he realized his cup wasn't there. His convenience cup, his mother called it. She had always been fond of alliteration. There was a stack of newspapers and magazines on the kitchen table. His mother had never even bothered to get the large type versions of any of these publications. Maybe she didn't want to acknowledge the truth, always convinced his eyes would just somehow get better. The dark side of wishful thinking, he guessed. Nothing's going wrong, the captain says as he sinks along with his ship. If he pressed his face close enough to the type, he could read and comprehend just fine, even though the words shimmied and waved as if they were caught in a gentle stream. True, he had to rest his eyes every 20 minutes or so, but without his mom here checking up on him, look out, literary party time. Maybe he'd even try to make sense of some graphs and charts. How could my eyes get any worse? he'd snort whenever his mom would tell him not to strain his eyes. Then she'd always give him that frazzled look. "Oh, don't you even start." He usually obliged, realizing the benefits of the mutually shared illusion that avoiding strain to his eyes would somehow make any difference to two scarred retinas. It took Max less than 20 minutes to find something interesting in the paper to read. His mother would have let him try to read War and Peace in one sitting if she saw the intense interest generated by one of the articles in the recent Journal News, Westchester County, New York's local paper. Successful use of experimental retinal therapy bodes well for detached retina sufferers. If you had learned that White Plains, New York resident Dennis Dunham had undergone an experimental procedure making use of nanotechnology particles, you would probably guess the procedure concerned his teeth. That's because, these days, Dennis cannot stop smiling. But you'd be wrong, because in what ophthalmologists are calling a revolutionary breakthrough, nanoparticles were actually used to fix structural damage to his eyes. The traditional procedure to fix a detached retina, where something called a scleral buckle is secured around the eyeball to reattach the retina closer to the vitreous membrane, is often incapable of restoring full sight. Dennis, however, was chosen to be a test case for a new procedure, in which nanotechnology particles were used to fill and restore tears to his left retina, which had recently detached as a result of a serious car accident. Dennis is grateful for how well the procedure has worked out. "It's great. My vision's perfect, 20/20, if not better." Ophthalmologists and retinal specialists tracking the results of the procedure report no complications, not even the swelling or dry eye that often accompany the use of a scleral buckle. "We are thrilled with the results," reports Dr. Howard Charles, Mr. Dunham's retinal surgeon. "In the next few years, we hope to be able to bring this technology to market." Medical device experts, however, estimate that the technology may not be readily available to the public for several years, if not longer. Max's day had taken an abrupt but welcome right turn. His eyes were just as damaged as always, and he was surely as cynical a bastard as ever, but something about holding that article in his hand filled him with possibility. Placing it back on the table, his eyes were still shattered placeholders, and thoughts of earthly concerns he couldn't cope with threatened to bring to mind that astute adage about hands wishing and shitting. But no, fuck that. He had explained to his mom time and time again why her belief in wishful thinking did nothing for him, as he had no hope in sight. He sighed internally when she inevitably failed to recognize the pun. But now, even though he was still stuck in his plight and some other person, some Dennis Dunham, was extolling the miracle of restored sight, well, it was something, wasn't it? He had to meet him. White Plains was only about a 20-minute cab ride tops. He made it back to his room and ventured into his closet, toward the back, in all its musty glory. In the far corner, concealed behind a pile of clothes he was shocked his mother hadn't thrown out, was his personal shoebox. He had hastily and imprudently dumped all of his essential belongings, cash, wallet, personal ID, into this shoebox, which was just as innocuous as everything else in his closet, and therefore just as apt to be thoughtlessly discarded by his mother the next time she became overcome by boredom, caffeine, and the need to clean house. In a trend he hoped would continue, he found his savings, about $400, and all his essentials accounted for. He made his way to the family computer with an alacrity unknown to him. Finding Mr. Dennis Dunham of White Plains, New York was not hard, nor was finding his employer's website, his job title, and, most importantly, his work number. Max didn't know what day it was, but just playing the odds and calling his work number sounded like a safe bet. He clutched the house phone in his hand and stayed absolutely still. He knew this was a moment. Typically, he'd shy away, unable to go through with it, preferring to hold out hope and at least have something, a goal, a dream, to irrationally pine for rather than make the mistake of being proactive and remove all doubt. As a general rule, as he repeated to himself, he preferred the quixotic to the quotidian. He also rather preferred to have someone in his life who would appreciate that clever bon mot, perhaps a cute, nurturing girl, someone warm and bubbly, maybe someone who bit her lip when she laughed, and his thoughts returned to the phone and what it represented. He closed his eyes and dialed. Hello? Hello? Yes, hello? Is this Dennis Dunham? Yes, speaking. It felt right to keep his eyes shut during the conversation. His vision was hopeless and cracked, and keeping his eyes closed ensured Dennis's words somehow wouldn't slip through those cracks. Illogical, yes. Appropriate? Somehow. This may sound weird, but I read your article, interview, whatever, in the journal news, and I'm not crazy or weird, I promise, but it really moved me. I suffered 2 detached retinas, actually, practically at the same time, like 2 years ago, within 2 weeks of each other. My vision is ruined. It's all wavy, you know? It was really hard to take. Crazy. I'm young, too, in my mid-20s like you. Not that that's what's important, right? But, I mean, I don't know, it's cool to hear of someone like me who might understand, you know, what it's like. After this fiasco, I'll need to recite portions of Frankenstein to myself just to hear articulate words coming out of my mouth. I'm usually not so inarticulate, sorry. Yeah, that made things better, asshole. No need to apologize, man. I'm glad. I've actually gotten lots of emails from people who've gone through what we've gone through. I'm always glad to hear from people. I'm glad it inspired you. I'm sorry to hear about your eye problem, and I hope things get better for you. I really do. Something irked him about Dennis's references to his lots of emails, as if he were a politician shaking the hands of his constituents en route to his armored car, waving back to them as his barricade led him to bigger and better things. At least he hadn't said something stupid like, "Don't call us retinal sufferers, we're retinal survivors." Well, thanks. I've had a remarkable string of coincidences. You have no idea. And then finding that article, especially since I have trouble even reading a newspaper, well, that was something. Finding someone who went through that, who lives so close to me, actually. What are the odds? Yeah, well, I'm glad. It's cool to hear from you. Listen, he said, a little too abruptly. He could just imagine Dennis thinking, oh God, here's where things get strange. But you're only 20 or so minutes away from me. I'm in Ossining, and I've never actually met anyone with my problem before, let alone anyone my age. Would it be cool if we, hung out or something? I could come down there, just grab lunch or coffee or something. The pause was positively deadly. Yeah, I think that would be okay. There's a Starbucks right across the street from where I work, actually, on Main Street, near the movie theater. Okay, I could find that and meet you there. How about later today? His brain, he realized, was still playing perpetual catch-up with his mouth. Oh, yeah, I guess that could work, actually. I don't have any plans today after work, really. How about, 5:30? Yeah, sure. What is that, 3 hours? About that. Cool, man. Cool. I'll meet you out in front of the Starbucks. Cool, man. I appreciate it. It'll be cool. I know you may be wary of, hanging out with some stranger, but, I appreciate it. Think about it anyways. I'm disabled. If I tried anything, you could probably beat me up. Why, oh why am I still speaking? That was a joke. I mean, not that you couldn't, but, you know. Yeah, cool. Okay, man. 5:30, see you there. He could no longer use Uber because he had trouble making out any details on his phone. Max hung up and dialed the local taxi company. It was a number he'd committed to memory, and now he finally got to use it. Max? Yes, sirree. How'd you know? Dennis just had a feeling. Just something about this guy, an air of slouchy, inward sadness. The way he stood near the door, massaging his hands, jittery. He seemed to be perpetually lifting his eyes, like a puppy solicitous of and eager to regain his master's affection. Lucky guess, I guess. Starbucks' economic fortunes were supposedly on the wane, but you'd never know it, given the line of people eagerly awaiting their chance to fork over $7 or more for Starbucks' brand of glorified milkshakes. They still have Frappuccinos, right? They certainly do. I can't read the menu back there. Max motioned broadly toward the indistinct blur of text and color behind the counter. So it makes me something of a traditionalist. A Frappuccino, man. Yeah, good to stick to the classics. Can't go wrong with the classics. You okay, by the way? Yeah, Max said, interlocking his fingers to prevent his hands from traveling to and fro, as if they were under arrest. Just nervous, honestly. Nah, don't be. It's cool, man. Dennis was, in no small part, relieved that Max was true to his word and didn't appear to be a homicidal maniac. After getting their drinks, they grabbed a seat outside. So, man, is your vision really fully restored? Yeah, it is. Wow, that's awesome. Dennis pecked at his macchiato. Only my left eye was detached, by the way. My right eye was fine the whole time. The left was briefly detached after a car accident. Oh. Telling Max this fact about his right eye felt more like an admission of something rather than just a clarification. Dennis didn't want to continue, but something compelled him. Yeah, before I got the procedure, my right eye compensated for me, so it wasn't that huge of a deal. Ah. Yeah. Dennis took a long pull from his macchiato as Max's iced frappuccino sat unattended, the ice disappearing into his cup and diluting the drink. If you don't mind, what happened to your eyes? Dennis asked. Genetics, I guess. Growing up, I always had severe astigmatism. Astigmatism. The word always bringing to mind stigmata and all its concomitant notions about suffering. I always had eyeball floaters, you know, those black dots in the vision. So while I was at college, and I went to college out of state, my left retina detached and I didn't do anything about it. I knew something was wrong. I remember being at a museum, and when I closed my right eye, I couldn't read the museum display in the periphery of my vision, like it looked all cut off. But I didn't think it was anything serious. Thought I just needed a new prescription or something. So I told my mom, and of course, she told me to just stop worrying, that I was always worried about everything and I just needed my prescription changed. And I talked to other people and they were like, yeah, you're fine, you're a worrier, chill out, kids in their 20s don't go blind. So I just let myself believe it because I didn't want to think about the consequences. Plus, my family didn't have a lot of money and I had shitty insurance. So I just waited, and like a week or so later, the same shit happened to my right eye. So I got rushed to an emergency room because I couldn't even recognize myself in the mirror anymore. Jesus. That part about not having a lot of money was a literal lie, but an emotional truth. His father paid his child support and his more than fair share of the divorce agreement, and Max and his mom weren't hurting for money. But for some reason, it didn't feel like a lie. It was a cultural shorthand to convey the deprivation he felt in his soul. Well, I was partly right. Turns out I did need a new prescription. just a zillion times stronger than before. Dennis snorted to show he understood the joke, but laughing felt disrespectful. Yeah, the doctors told me the odds of both my retinas detaching in like a 2-week period is practically unheard of. If they'd caught it sooner, they could have frozen the right eye and closed all the holes forming. So after the surgeries, my eyes are still fucked up. But they closed the holes that formed, so all that vitreous gel that seeped in through the holes in my eyes are stuck in there, so it's like weird. It's like all these black spots. It's like a Japanese rimpa painting. Dennis nodded, pantomiming understanding. It's like a veritable black dot army. Dennis regretted being so cavalier about the triviality of his trauma. He should have embellished or something. I try not to let the experience completely deprive me, Max lied. I wasn't some sad sack before, I try not to be now. I could be pretty funny before, well-liked, kind of. That joke about needing glasses a zillion times stronger, that's just a drop in the bucket of the jokes I have to offer to my adoring public. He smiled sheepishly and sipped from his water and sugar chino. Whatever burdens were inhibiting Max at the beginning of their meeting had been seemingly transferred to Dennis. Now it was Max who interrupted the slurping and sipping, his speech quickening, keeping pace with his burgeoning enthusiasm. So that nanotech was some pretty serious shit, right? Dennis explained how he had been selected for the procedure, gliding over choice details he'd rather not divulge, worrying that each pause used to assemble his story was overly suggestive with intimations of the nepotism he was carefully excising from his story. With impressive candor, but growing shame, he admitted that returning to his previous life post-surgery had been essentially seamless. Cool. So you never see any floaters? No. Cool. Even then, as Max shifted his vision, a bright light, some remnant of the vitreous gel held captive behind his eye, lumbered into his view and temporarily blocked his vision. An eclipse of the heart was romantic. An eclipse of the eye, not so much. The floaters always reminded him of going to the aquarium as a kid and looking through those portholes and seeing those massive whales coming out of nowhere, absent-mindedly drifting into sight, making their presence known, blocking out everything else, and then floating on by. Cool, Max repeated. Yeah, so I've tried to not let my eye problem define me. Sometimes before I go to bed, I try to spin it to myself as a positive, like a humbling experience, as a way to be less superficial. I can date ugly girls now with great personalities, no problem. Though that hasn't really worked out too much. See, I tried to be positive, but it doesn't always work out that way. If Dennis had met Max under different circumstances, he could imagine the two becoming genuine friends. They shared the same morbid sense of humor and lapidary delivery. But Dennis knew the low-level idolatry on display was toxic, and what made it worse was that Dennis could picture Max before his accident, before his cool composure had curdled into this obvious, transparent need. Even now, Max looked at Dennis almost longingly, fearful of silences, desirous of chatter, as if to reassure himself that his presence was welcomed. It was nice meeting you, Max. Dennis had become so impatient to leave that he almost believed that he really did have somewhere else to go. Yeah, I should get back. My mom might be worried about me. God, could have phrased that better. Well, anyway, thanks for meeting with me. It's cool to meet someone like me. I now know why all the Asian kids sat together at the school cafeteria. He smiled meekly. They exchanged information one more time and went their separate ways. Dennis had the overwhelming desire to get the fuck out of there, grab a beer, smoke a blunt, look at porn, go out, do anything, do something. Instead, Dennis went home and exploited his therapist's mistake of giving him an emergency contact number and practically bullied the poor guy into granting him an early morning appointment for the next day. Max's house was still empty when he returned home, which was fine by him. As he prepared to order in some pizza on the house phone, he saw the little splotchy red button that meant voicemail was blinking. "Hi, Barbara. I forgot you're at your mom's for the week, so forget this message. I'll call you on your cell. I hope you're doing okay, relaxing as best you can. You deserve it. Lord knows you deserve it. Speak to you in a second." Well, that was that. Mom was out of town. House party. The rest of the day was uneventful. He even wrote that down on a notepad next to his bed as he got ready to go to sleep. He read it back to himself. The day was uneventful. He found it funny how the sentence could be true, but still fail to convey the emotional truth of the sentiment. Someone could read, "The day was uneventful," and nod their head sympathetically. But a truly uneventful day, with nothing to do, nothing to look forward to, the ceaseless, groaning hours, time without end, couldn't be conveyed in any one sentence or any combination of sentences. The emptiness of the day accreted into something almost tangible, a weight that never left him. As he prepared himself for bed, he reminded himself that suffering was a way of getting closer with the universe. Everything suffered. In that rush of emotions before sleep, he felt a kinship to all those who suffered. And that meant something to him, something he knew was of value, but for a reason he could not be sure of. Middle-class kids always tried to pass themselves off as being somehow disadvantaged. Everyone needs to believe they overcame something. It meant something to him to know that his suffering was real. "Thanks for meeting me on such short notice," was how Dennis greeted his therapist the following morning. "It's no problem. I had a cancellation this morning. No need to apologize." Whenever he went to a therapist, he always had to ignore that little voice in his head that told him he was being bilked. The therapist had a good racket. Having an insurance company pay you $95 to plaintively nod your head? "So, what do you want to talk about this morning?" He paused, trying to think of a way to relay everything without sounding too melodramatic. "I was contacted out of the blue by this kid, about my age, who was essentially legally blind. Retinal problems like I suffered, except his were serious. My problem was no big deal. I got it all fixed. And I actually agreed to meet him, and I could see how happy and grateful he was to meet me, and as he was telling me all these terribly sad details, I was, like, zombified. I had so many things to say, but I just couldn't say anything, like I was in a trance, I don't know. I could only just picture him sitting in his mom's basement, no friends, frustrated, a smart kid with no outlets. And he was funny and searching for a friend. And I just sat there. I couldn't do anything. My personality disappeared. I felt like I was on display, just nodding to this kid with a real problem. Kinda like you." Dennis answered his therapist's typically limp questions, which, like always, concerned the same rote topics he'd discussed a million times before. It was as if his therapist was unwilling to extend the conversation beyond some agreed-upon purview. Dennis had in mind a man looking for his keys who was too lazy to get up, so he limited his search to the couch he was seated upon. This session would be unhelpful, he concluded, so he bided his time, trying not to think about how frustrated he'd been in the past when he tried to ask the therapist a question after the session had ended, only to be rebuffed and told to wait until the next session to discuss it. When the session was over, he asked his therapist if it was normal to be experiencing this type of guilt. "We can talk about that at the next session." The euphoria of meeting Dennis had faded away, and he woke up again in his room with nothing to do. He endured these perpetually boring days, but vowed never to tolerate them, as if there had been some cosmic mix-up and he'd been wrongfully punished, and as the gods of fate shuffled through their paperwork and got up to speed, they would realize there'd been a terrible mistake and relieve him of this burden. He didn't do much. He ate some carrots, which reminded him of his mother, who always implored him to eat them because they were good for his eyes. He set them aside, because while they did nothing for his eyes, thinking about her constant protestations did too much for his sense of indignation. Sleep found him earlier than usual. He knew he was asleep because he felt alarm bells rippling through the fabric of the dream, as if the flapping of the butterflies in his stomach was reverberating up from his gut and into his brain. Zoloft, a sense impression. This was like the dreams he'd had when he tried Zoloft. Everything was too vivid. Dennis genuflecting before him, in reverie of some kind, the look in his eyes intense, his breathing heaving, ravenous, concupiscent for some need to be sated. Max put his palm to Dennis's forehead. From somewhere outside the dream, the contrarian aspect of Max's personality sparked to life. What is this shit? Palm on head? What is this, the Lion King? But the dream continued unabated, and that irascible part of him was no longer to be found. Dennis pushed forward and rubbed against Max's palm like a happy tabby cat. Dennis moaned a great, giant sucking sound. Across a great expanse, specks of luminous blue light. Their intensity contrasted sharply against the pitch black of the night. His palm was rigid, a cartoon billboard ordering, "Stop." It rested firmly over Dennis's left eye. Now, the specks were whirling around each other in tight formation, their proximity seeming to encourage them to burn brighter, hotter, faster. The black backdrop ebbed, and all became pellucid, nothing but warm, bright light. The detritus in Max's eyes seeped out, drops thick like nectar. His field of vision clouded completely. Then, gloop, vitreous gel descended from his eye to the floor. Plink. He could see. The blue morsels roared with frenzy. His heart pattered out of his chest, sweat stained each pore, and now he was awake in bed, motionless, until the adrenaline burned out of him. The next day was all the more uneventful for the dream that had preceded it. All the pizza he was eating made him constipated. He ate some flaccid grapes he found in the fridge. He hated eating overripe fruit. It always brought to mind some nightmare scenario of having to scour for food in garbage cans. He thought of calling Dennis, but declined. He dreamed again that night. It ended the same way. He could see. In the dream, Dennis looked on, coquettishly. Max had to call the next day. Dennis picked up on the first ring. That Dennis picked up at all surprised him. That he picked up on the first ring startled him. Max didn't expect that, and he wished he'd had more time to compose himself. "Hi." "Hey, glad you called." So he was. Max felt discombobulated by Dennis's newfound eagerness to learn all about him. "Your greatest fear?" "What?" "I asked if eye problems were always your greatest fear," Dennis repeated. "I guess. Also, you know when you're wearing a longish, button-down shirt? I always worried about taking a shit while wearing one of those and accidentally mistaking the toilet paper for it and wiping my ass with my own shirt." Dennis laughed, and Max smiled. "Hey, we should hang out this weekend. Grab a drink." "Really?" Max replied, curious. The butterflies were starting up. "I guess I can take a cab down there." They swapped addresses and vital information. "Hey man, one thing. Before I come over, you should Google me." The butterflies sparked to life. Max had crossed some threshold. He worried for his sleep. "What?" "You should Google me." Dennis involuntarily squinted his eyes, as if it would bring into sharper focus the purpose behind Max's request. He thought, of all things, of the time he was at Boston's South Station, waiting for his Amtrak train back to New York. A homeless guy had approached him, and just as he was bracing himself to deliver the usual spiel, the "sorry man," the show of empty hands, the guy caught Dennis off guard by asking him to buy him some soup. "Sure," Dennis had replied. "I can buy you some soup." So he did, and the homeless guy thanked him and told him his name, Clive Irving, and asked Dennis not to forget about him. Now he knew why he thought of Clive. Just like Clive's request for soup, Max's request to be Googled awoke Dennis from senescence and reminded him that he was dealing with a real person. Autonomic responses to the homeless, autonomic responses to charity, autonomic responses... This was charity, wasn't it? Hanging out with him because of pity? He was so zealous to prove to himself that he was a good person that he wasn't even considering what Max was saying or how he was feeling. He'd been going through the motions, and he felt he'd been inadvertently called out on it. Okay. Dennis resolved to do it with an open mind, even if only to find the back catalog of articles Max had written for a student newspaper, or the webcomic Max used to work on, or whatever it was Max wanted him to find. "Okay, cool. I'll see you Saturday, like noonish." "Cool. See you then." It was Thursday. Max had 2 days of waiting. He spent the rest of his time simultaneously terrified but excited about the dreams he might dream, to see if the specters and half-glimpsed images that visited him in his sleep would make themselves fully formed. As anxious as this all made him, it beat being bored. With all that he'd been through, he knew that meeting Dennis had been no accident. He dreamt again that night, but now the details were much grislier. The images came with a clarity unknown to him. At the denouement of the dream, again, he could see. All was clear. He awoke in a cold sweat. He lay on his bed, blanket wrapped around him, wishing he could believe that he was wrapped under a hermetic seal, a little universe all his own. Then he just lay there, as if through inaction he could pretend this was just any other day, any other boring day, that the dream hadn't occurred, that he had gotten the details wrong. But ever since he awoke that morning on the day he had met Dennis, he could no longer tolerate the concept of coincidence. He prepared himself, which itself felt like a sin. As he went about preparing himself, he performed his usual double takes at every visual distortion he recognized, hyper-aware of every incongruity between his sense of sight and what he knew the world to be. This was no real world, he told himself. I've learned that. This is something else, a phantasmagoria. Other people got to live in their world, the real world, while he was condemned to navigate this insufferable facsimile, a degraded vortex of askew angles and impossible distances. But no longer. He was cashing out. When the days had passed and the time came, he called the cab company and prepared for his trip. He rode stoically in silence in the back of the cab. He felt ugly and surly, and could picture a little dark storm cloud above his head. Hey man. Dennis's apartment was well designed, luxurious in a generic way, with its cliched reliance on high polish, gleaming surfaces, and modern angularity. Par for the course, there were little affects on the kitchen faucet, the type of stuff tailor-made to impress a newly working sorority girl. Max pondered what image he was supposed to be making out from Dennis's high-def flat screen, if the image weren't being filtered through the aquarium-like filter of his retina. High definition, low resolution. "So, man," Dennis invited. If the apartment had been disheveled, that would have been an obnoxious affront. That the apartment was antiseptic and clean, that too was an obnoxious affront. Max's voice inhabited the room more than his body. "So you get a chance to look me up online?" Max thought he saw Dennis unconsciously lift his eyebrows. "Yeah, man, I did. Creepy." "Creepy?" "Yeah, man, creepy. It's gotta be creepy to have someone with your same name kill himself. I'd call that creepy." "Yeah, I guess." Max's prize-fighter 1,000-yard stare temporarily broke. "You want a drink or anything? I got some beers in the fridge. Brooklyn Pennant Ales. Good shit." "No, I'm good." His syllables slowed to form, a step behind the chaos between his skull. "Maybe just an apple or something?" "Okay." He took an apple from the fridge and lobbed it softly from a foot away. He was a good shot. Max barely had to clench his hand to catch it. Still, it was an insensitive dick move, Max thought, pincher gripping the apple until stickiness smeared his fingertips. "Dennis, don't you think it's weird we're hanging out?" "No," he said, taking his first swig. "It was your idea. You saying it's weird is weird, actually." A moment of silence. "Come on, man. Stop. You seemed chill, interesting. You asked. I'm down to hang out. Some of my friends will be at some bars later. Ever been to the Thirsty Turtle?" What would meeting Dennis's friends be like? Attractive young professionals of serviceable intelligence and standard interests. Guys in finance, girls in advertising, juggling the demands of an active social life and a nascent career. Max acting as Dennis's token of magnanimity and humility. Max deceiving himself into pretending that, just maybe, he could create a lasting bond with any of these normal, happy people. Sure, he could be tolerated at social events, thought of as endearing in that sad, Eeyore-like way. But would they be willing to pick him up at his house, to accept him, integrate them into their group? And why would he even want them to, since they were likely dumb and boorish and boring, not of his milieu? God, what is wrong with me? With all my time to myself, all I do is nitpick, as if I'm any better than Dennis's friends, doing nothing, feeling sorry for myself. Think about the diving bell and butterfly, what that guy went through. No, fuck that. That shit made him feel worse about himself. Fuck that. He was young and smart and interesting and clever, warm and empathetic, and had it not been for 2 retinas and processes he couldn't comprehend, he'd never need to be settling and groveling for friends. Dennis was looking at him, brows furrowed, tense, like a dog waiting for the squirrel to pop out from the hole. "You know, Dennis, it kinda hurt my feelings when you lobbed that apple at me. You know my vision's bad." Dennis exhaled hard into his beer. "Okay, man, I'm sorry. Didn't mean anything by it." His voice echoed into the bottle. The impatience with which he said, "okay," said it all. "That wasn't someone else you read about online, by the way. Not a close reader there, huh?" Dennis went to the kitchen with another beer, popping it open with something on his keychain. "If you didn't hear me, I said that it wasn't some other person who killed himself. What article did you read? How many people named Max Hamlin in Ossining, New York do you think there are, man?" Dennis took a swig of his beer, slow and methodical. "What are you trying to say?" "Let me ask again. How many people named Max Hamlin do you think live in Ossining, New York?" "I don't know," he shrugged. "One less than there was 2 weeks ago." "I killed myself, Dennis. I killed myself," he repeated, shaking his head, tingling. Dennis didn't flinch. No, you didn't. You're talking to me right now. You didn't fucking kill yourself. Either it was someone else with your name, or the magazine fucked up and saw your name and got the dead person confused with you, or you tried to kill yourself or something and the story got misreported or something. Now it was Max's turn to dismissively exhale. What had he expected? Dennis's explanations were aggravating in their plausibility. He liked Dennis cursing, pissed, losing patience. At least it showed that he wasn't patronizing or infantilizing. But no, that would come next, now that Max was tearing up. Must be the stress, Dennis was probably thinking, or the loneliness. This has all signified nothing, Max thought. Soon this stress and aggravation would be over and he'd be back home, and the night would unfold as usual, another night accompanied by his overbearing mother. Then, back to his bed, his stillness punctuated by his joyless, flaccid masturbation and the futile attempts to affix his gaze on the undulating typeface of whatever life-affirming self-help book his mom had bought for him. As had happened 2 weeks before, what his future had in store unfurled before him. Celibacy, stagnation, dependence, permanent townie status. That's why he let himself sink into that warm bathwater with that cold, unfeeling razor blade, wasn't it? Sorry, Mom, he'd said aloud, and saying that aloud had made him feel even more like a disappointment and a whiny, spoiled bitch. Even in death, he was denied dignity. Aw, little baby. Everyone's got to feel bad for the little baby, don't they? Life's too tough, isn't it? Not enough to make your mom dote on you night and day? Aw, little boy genius can't allow any room for dishonor, can he? Not so different from those douchebags you hold in such contempt, huh? Maybe I can change, he'd thought. Be stoic. But those thoughts tumbled to and fro, sparked and were gone. Warm tears down his cheek, warmth spurting from his wrists, warmth all around him, sinking. I'm going to tell you something, Dennis. Explain this to me if you're so fucking smart. I killed myself. For better or worse, I killed myself. I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do, but I did it. And then, now, miraculously, I'm back, like nothing ever happened. And so, coincidentally, I return, you could say, while my mother's away, grieving over me. And, coincidentally, I just happened to read a cover story in a local paper that I never paid attention to before. This cover story is about a kid around my age who suffered the same problem I did and was cured. And he lived nearby. And when I got in contact with him, he agreed to meet me. Now, tell me, what are the odds of all that happening? Dennis knew this was his opportunity to play at being the consoler. Instead, he backed away. Why did I come back? Just to have all this fall in my lap, just like that? To inspire me? Just to torture me by introducing me to someone who survived this? Look, no, that can't be. I'm a good person. I wouldn't deserve that. Look, man, listen to me. No, you listen to me now. And with that, Dennis's dithering ceased. I've been having dreams, Dennis. As if returning to this life and meeting you weren't enough, well, I've been having dreams. At first, in these dreams, you were bowing down to me. My hand was on the top of your head, like I was blessing you, you know? And then I'd put my palm over your eyelids, over the retina that detached and that you got fixed. And when I did that, then I could see. I could see perfectly. Dennis stood still, so many urges pulling him in so many directions that all he could do was stand still, mind agape. And then the dreams changed. Your eye was in my hand. I'd taken it. Dennis's jaw locked, made of metal. Max set his worthless eyes upon the fuzzy, dissolute shape before him and allowed his mind to fill in the blanks. What am I doing? Why am I doing this to Dennis? This isn't his fault. Max hardened himself against these thoughts, dug his nails into his palm, pictured himself breathing smoke, the way he had steeled himself against the taunts of his father by doing his best to look intense and slightly crazed. "Uh-oh, I forgot," his father used to say, long before the eye problems, for as long as he could remember. "You're a tough guy. I forgot. Better not mess with you." "You are absolutely fucking crazy. Listen to yourself. You're crazy. I know you've had a tough life, but you just escaped from an insane asylum. Look it up. You've been in an insane asylum. Somehow you escaped." Dennis had nothing but intuition to back up his claim. Max just nodded and smiled a little, like the way he used to with his father, the way he used to absorb all his comments and turn them into smirks, like this was just one big amusement. That's not true, and you know it. You are just making that up. Don't be stupid. Don't be stupid? You must be crazy. What are you even saying? Holding my fucking eye? How the fuck would that fix your vision? Your problems with your retinas, remember? Listen to yourself. You are fucking crazy. Now get out of here. Dennis still thinks he can bully around the invalid, does he? Now why shouldn't I leave, right? Go back home and let you lead your precious little life. How dare I? I'm sorry I didn't have some well-connected daddy to get me on some list to get my retina fixed. You're one bad retina, right? You only had problems with one retina, right? God, I had problems with both my retinas. How dare someone like me even deign to disgrace you with my presence, you selfish fucking prick? The only reason you met me is because you know I'm right. You felt bad, guilty about your little rich kid bullshit problems, your little fake bullshit problem that daddy got all fixed up for you. I bet you tell girls all about it. It's your big admission, your big reveal to get them to think you're a survivor, that you've got some life history. Any thoughts of Dennis's unwitting innocence burned away. I'm sorry my mommy couldn't get my problems fixed, but that's what we have second chances for, now isn't it? No theory of morality Max ascribed to could defend what he planned to do. No great philosopher could articulate a moral theory absolving him. But the tremors of terror he'd felt every morning after opening these eyes and realizing once again, oh my God, this is fucking real, this is still happening. Beneath that realization, there was a morality of intuition and self-preservation that ran deeper than sonorous intonations and ivory tower pipe dreams. Max crossed the space between them full bore. Dennis pivoted and prepared himself, like a little boy playing keep-away with a football. He capitulated far easier than anticipated. Get the fuck off me! Max was on top of him, knees pinned to his shoulders, in position to rain down blows if only he had known how to throw a punch. Fuck that. He fiended so badly for that eye that his fucking blood itched. As Dennis attempted to catch his breath, he opened his eyes to find that his field of vision began and ended with Max's thumb. This was real. This can't be reversed. Oh God. Oh God. The thumb found wetness and burrowed. Sounds of a wet foot stuck in mud. Max extended and chewed on his tongue. Michael Jordan, a warrior intent on the task at hand. He had no bearing of what he was doing with his left arm. It felt alternatively numb toward the top, yet somehow saturated. All that mattered was his burrowing right hand. he was back in a junior high haunted house, smushing peeled grapes. He was a medieval hero, plowing through the muck to get that precious mandrake root. Digging, digging, digging. Digging through what? No matter. Digging, digging, digging. Until he pulled, and out it came. A little pop, an audible record of satisfaction, like when he used to pull out weeds on the front lawn. He waited until he could catch his breath. He waited for a while. Blood trickled down his left arm, Dennis's teeth still clamped around it like a bear trap. Spit, vomit, and blood faux-hawked the hair on Max's left arm, which had found its way so far down Dennis's throat that, if he made a thumbs up, Dennis's throat would bulge like a bullfrog. All that mattered was what he held in his right hand, his clenched fist. He brought this clenched fist to his lips and kissed his knuckles like a jubilant prizefighter. Vermiculate tendrils, viscera, little odds and ends of mysterious biology poked through the spaces between his fingers. He couldn't bear to open his eyes. They were shut so tight he half anticipated his eyeballs would explode in a gushy pop. He stayed hovering over Dennis's prostrate body until, dare he? Max opened his eyes, very quickly, quicker than his quickest blink, and closed them again. At some point, he must have freed his left arm, because now he was rummaging through Dennis's pants pockets, eyes still shut, until he found Dennis's phone. He regretted making out random glimpses of names, Amy, Annie, Bert, and submerged any inkling that these names represented people who had any relationship with Dennis. He called his mother's cell phone. Miraculously, even though she'd frustrated him again and again in the past by burying her fucking cell phone in the deepest recesses of her overstuffed purse, still, somehow, she picked up. "Hello? Who's this?" He'd never felt his heart beat so fast. "Hello?" She spoke louder, thick with the obnoxious impatience of the older generation, as if the louder she spoke, the quicker answers would come. Before she hung up, believing him to be some oblivious wrong caller, he spoke. "Mom, it's me. It's Max." A sound he couldn't peg, and then, How dare you? Who is this? I'll have you know." "Mom, listen to my voice. Listen to me. Listen to my voice." "How dare!" "Idiosyncratic. IDIOSYNCRATIC. Do you remember how I loved that word and how proud I was to learn how to spell it? Do you remember how I learned the alphabet by reference to dinosaurs? A is for Allosaurus, B is for Brontosaurus? Listen to me, Mom. It's me. I can't explain how, but I'm back, Mom. I've come back, and I'm sorry." "I'm sorry," he'd said. He'd felt sorry for so long now. But now all of his empathy and compassion were now his again, to dole out, to make people happy, to be him again. "My son is dead. My son is dead. He killed himself. Please, stop this. You have no idea. Please, please never call this number again." Max opened his eyes to soak it all in. He now really understood all the fuss about high-definition television. The ticker on the bottom of the screen, the news or whatever. Lord, those words were so crisp he could just stick out his hand, snap them right off the screen, and stick them in his pocket. "Mom, it's me. I'm back. I'm here. I'm in an apartment in White Plains. I need you to pick me up. And Mom, I can see." He spoke, his body spasming, his eyes no longer perpetually dry, if his tears were any indication. "I'm back, Mom. I can see. Dear God, I can see!"
Chilling tales for dark nights.